I'll never forget the look on my son's face when his own grandmother shut the door on him. Ethan was 10 years old, soaking wet, standing in the rain for 3 hours, because his key didn't work anymore. When I pulled up and saw him shivering on that porch, the porch of the house I'd sacrificed everything to save, I knew something was horribly wrong. Then my mother came out. Not to apologize, not to help. "We've all decided you don't live here anymore," she said, her voice cold as ice. "Your sister and her family are moving in." The house I'd paid $80,000 to rescue from foreclosure. The house they'd promised would be mine. The house where I'd grown up, where my son had taken his first steps. Gone. Just like that. My sister Susan stood behind her holding the new keys, wearing that same smile she'd worn when she stole my fiancé 10 years ago. That night, my son asked me a question that broke my heart. "Mommy, why does Grandma hate us?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But 3 days later, I sent a message that made my parents' faces go white. Because what they didn't know was that I had proof that would unravel everything. Proof that would expose secrets buried for 40 years. This is the story of how I lost everything. And then discovered the truth that destroyed my family forever. You think you know where this is going. You don't. Stay until the end. Because when the rain finally stopped, no one was left standing where they started. My name is Mary Williams, and at 37 years old, I thought I'd finally figured out how to survive. I worked double shifts as a nurse at County General, raised my 10-year-old son Ethan alone after his father walked out, and somehow managed to keep us both fed, clothed, and safe. Safe. That word used to mean something to me. It meant having a roof over our heads, a door that locked a place where my boy could sleep without fear. But on that October evening in 2017, I learned that safety is just an illusion, and family can be the cruelest lie of all. The rain started just after 4 o'clock, the kind of cold autumn rain that seeps into your bones and doesn't let go. I was finishing my shift at the hospital when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Mom?" Ethan's voice was small, trembling. "Mom, my key doesn't work." My heart dropped. "What do you mean it doesn't work, baby?" "I've been trying for an hour. I'm outside. It's raining really hard and I'm getting wet, and the key just keeps turning but the door won't open and—" "I'm coming right now. Stay by the door under the porch roof if you can. I'll be there in 15 minutes. I didn't wait for the elevator. I ran down 4 flights of stairs, my scrubs still damp with sweat from a 12-hour shift, my mind racing through possibilities. Broken lock, stuck mechanism. Maybe Ethan was using the wrong key. Anything but what I feared most, that my mother had finally done what she'd been threatening to do for months. The drive home felt like swimming through concrete. Every red light was an eternity. Every slow driver was torture. When I finally turned onto Maple Street and saw my son, my baby, standing on that porch soaked to the skin, his backpack sagging with rainwater, his lips tinged blue from the cold, something inside me shattered. I threw the car into park and ran. "Ethan." He turned, and the relief on his face nearly broke me. "Mom, I couldn't get in. I tried and tried, but—" "It's okay, baby. It's okay. I'm here now." I pulled him against me, feeling how cold he was, how he was shaking. 3 hours. He'd called from a neighbor's phone after trying for an hour. He'd been standing in the rain for almost 3 hours. I pulled out my own key, the one I'd had since I was 17, the one that had opened this door 10,000 times. I slid it into the lock. It turned, but the door didn't budge. What the— I tried again. The lock mechanism worked, but something else was blocking it. A deadbolt. A new deadbolt. And that's when the door opened from the inside. My mother stood there, dry and warm, her gray hair perfectly set, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Behind her, I could see my sister Susan holding a set of shiny new keys. "Mom," I said, my voice catching. "What's going on? Why won't our keys work? Ethan's been standing out here for hours. We've all decided you don't live here anymore, Ruth said, her voice flat and final as a judge's gavel. Your sister and her family are moving in. You need to collect your things and go. The world tilted. What, Mom? This is my home, our home. You can't just— The house is in my name, she said. Not yours. And I've decided that Susan needs it more than you do. She has 3 children. You only have 1. But I paid $80,000 to save this house. The words tore out of me, raw and desperate. When the bank was going to foreclose, I paid $40,000 of my own money and borrowed another $40,000 to keep you from losing it. You promised me the house would be mine. Susan stepped forward, then dangling those new keys like a taunt. Well, Mom changed her mind. The house is hers to do with as she pleases. I looked at my mother, searching for some trace of the woman who'd raised me, who'd kissed my scraped knees and braided my hair, and told me she loved me. But her eyes were cold, distant, like I was a stranger begging on her doorstep. And maybe that's exactly what I'd become. Please, I whispered, and I hated how small my voice sounded. Mom, please. It's raining. Ethan is freezing. Just let us get some clothes, let us stay tonight, and we can figure this out tomorrow. No. She stepped back and began to close the door. You don't live here anymore. The lock clicked. Final. Absolute. I stood there in the rain with my son staring at the door that had just closed on our entire lives. Ethan looked up at me, his brown eyes huge and confused and so young. Mommy, he whispered. Why does Grandma hate us? I couldn't answer. I couldn't even breathe. That night we slept in my Honda Civic, Ethan curled up in the back seat with my nursing jacket as a blanket, me in the front with my seat reclined as far as it would go. The rain drummed on the roof like accusations. My son shivered beside me despite the car's struggling heater. And as I listened to his teeth chatter, I made a promise in the darkness, a promise that tasted like blood and felt like iron. They would regret this. The next morning I woke with my neck screaming in pain and my son's quiet breathing the only thing keeping me from screaming myself. Ethan was still asleep in the back seat, his face peaceful in a way that broke my heart. He didn't understand yet what we'd lost. He didn't know that the roof over his head, the bedroom where he'd grown from toddler to boy, the backyard where he'd learned to ride a bike, all of it was gone because of a lie I'd believed 2 years ago. I believed my mother when she promised me the house would be mine. It was August 2015 when the foreclosure notice arrived. I remember because it was Ethan's 8th birthday, and I'd taken the day off work to throw him a small party in the backyard. My mother called me inside, her hands shaking as she held the official-looking envelope. My father sat at the kitchen table, his face gray, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. "We're going to lose the house," my mother said, her voice barely a whisper. "The bank is foreclosing. We have 60 days. I looked at the notice. They were behind on payments, way behind. 18 months of missed mortgage payments, penalty fees, interest compounding on interest. The total amount due was staggering $80,000. How did this happen? I asked, though I already knew. My father's construction business had gone under when the economy crashed. They'd been living on credit cards and prayers ever since robbing Peter to pay Paul, hoping for a miracle that never came. "We tried everything," my father said, and I'd never heard him sound so defeated. "Refinancing, loan modifications, payment plans. Nothing worked. They want the full amount or they're taking the house." I looked around that kitchen, the kitchen where my mother had taught me to bake cookies, where I'd done my homework at that same table where 3 generations of our family had gathered for Sunday dinners. This house was more than walls and a roof. It was our history, our foundation, our home. "I have $40,000 in my retirement account," I heard myself say. "I can borrow against it." My mother's head snapped up. "Mary, no, that's your future. This house is my future," I said, surprised by how certain I felt. "It's Ethan's future. I'm not letting the bank take it." But $40,000 wasn't enough. We were still 40,000 short, and the clock was ticking. I applied for loans and was denied. My credit wasn't good enough to borrow that much. I lay awake nights doing math that never added up, watching the deadline creep closer. Then 3 weeks before the foreclosure date, something impossible happened. I came home from work to find my parents sitting at the kitchen table with a check. A cashier's check for $40,000. "Where did this come from?" I asked, staring at it like it might disappear. "A donation," my mother said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. "An old friend of your father's heard about our situation. He wanted to help." "What friend who would just give us $40,000? "His name is Edward," my father said quietly. "Edward Morrison. We knew him years ago. He's done well for himself, and he remembered us. That's all you need to know." It felt wrong, too convenient, but I was desperate and the deadline was days away. I took my $40,000, added Edward Morrison's mysterious $40,000, and paid off the bank. The house was saved. "Mary," my mother said that day, gripping both my hands in hers, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us. You saved this family. I promise you, when your father and I are gone, this house will be yours. We'll put it in writing. You have my word." My father nodded solemnly. "We'll transfer the deed to you. You've earned it." I believed them. God help me. I believed every word. For 2 years, I waited for them to make good on that promise. I asked about it twice, carefully, respectfully, not wanting to seem greedy or pushy. Each time, my mother put me off. "We'll do it soon, dear. We're just getting the paperwork in order." Or, "Your father's been so busy we haven't had time to meet with the lawyer." I should have pushed harder. I should have demanded proof. But they were my parents, and I trusted them. Then came the day 3 months ago when I stopped by unannounced and found Susan's car in the driveway. My sister hadn't visited in over a year. We'd never been close, not since she was born, and became the golden child who could do no wrong. I walked in to find her sitting at the dining room table with my parents' documents spread out before them. "What's going on?" I asked. They all jumped like I'd caught them stealing. "Just family business," my mother said quickly, gathering up the papers. But not quickly enough. I saw the letterhead county clerk's office, property transfer documents. "Are you finally transferring the deed?" I asked, feeling hopeful for the first time in months. "I can sign whatever you need." "It's already done," Susan said, and there was something triumphant in her smile. "Mom and Dad transferred the house to me last week." The room went silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock. "What?" The word came out strangled. "Susan needed it more," my mother said, not looking at me. "She has 3 children. You only have Ethan. It makes more sense for her to have the house." I found the documents later after I'd stopped shaking enough to think clearly. I filed a Freedom of Information request with the county clerk's office. The deed transfer had been recorded on August 23, 2015. 3 days after I'd paid off the bank. 3 days after I'd saved their house from foreclosure. And there on the signature line where I should have signed agreeing to the transfer was my name in handwriting that wasn't mine. They'd forged my signature. Used me for my money, then threw me away like garbage. And then I saw the new name on the mailbox, Susan Whitmore. The transfer had happened 3 days after I paid. I found them at church the following Sunday. They never missed a service. My mother loved the appearance of piety, the way people greeted her as a pillar of the community. She sat in the 3rd pew from the front, the same seat she'd occupied for 30 years. My father beside her with his head bowed like he was praying. Maybe he was. Maybe he was asking God to forgive him for what he'd done to his daughter. I waited until the service ended, until the congregation filed out into the autumn sunshine, everyone shaking hands and making plans for potluck dinners. I stood by their car, Ethan beside me, the forged documents clutched in my hand. My mother saw me first. Her face went pale, then hardened into something cold and impenetrable. "Mary, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you." I held up the papers. About these. My father wouldn't look at me. He stared at his shoes like they held the answers to questions he didn't want to ask. Not here, my mother hissed, glancing around at the other churchgoers. Always worried about appearances, always concerned with what people would think. Yes, here, I said, and my voice was louder than I intended. People were starting to look. You forged my signature. You stole the house I paid for. I want to know why. Lower your voice, she snapped. You're making a scene. I don't care about your scene. The words exploded out of me. 2 years of hurt and betrayal and sleepless nights in a Honda Civic. I gave you everything. I emptied my retirement account. I saved your house from foreclosure, and you repaid me by stealing it and giving it to Susan. We did what we had to do, my mother said, her voice dropping to that same cold, flat tone she'd used when she locked me out. To protect the family. Protect the family. I wanted to laugh, but it came out more like a sob. I'm your family. Ethan is your family. We're sleeping in my car because of you. For just a moment, something flickered across my father's face. Shame, maybe, or regret. He opened his mouth as if to speak. David, my mother said sharply, and he closed it again. But I'd seen it, that moment of weakness. Dad, I said, turning to him, ignoring my mother completely. Dad, please, just tell me why. If you're going to destroy me, at least tell me why. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and I saw how old he'd become. When had the lines around his eyes gotten so deep? When had his shoulders begun to stoop? I owed a debt, he whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear him. To the man who saved us all. What man? What are you talking about? David, that's enough, my mother said, her hand gripping his arm, but he kept talking, the words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back for too long. Edward Morrison. The money, the $40,000, it wasn't a gift. It was payment. For a debt I could never repay. And when he asked me to, I said that's enough. My mother's voice cracked like a whip. My father flinched and fell silent. Edward Morrison, I repeated. The man who donated the money to save the house. What does he have to do with this? Nothing, my mother said firmly. Your father is confused. He's been under a lot of stress. He doesn't look confused. He looks guilty. This conversation is over. She pulled open the car door. David, get in the car. No, I said, stepping forward. No, you don't get to walk away. Not this time. I want answers. I want to know why you did this to me. Why you forged my signature. Why you gave my house, the house I paid for, to Susan. Because Susan is family, my mother said, and there was something in her voice I'd never heard before. Something almost like pain. And you... She stopped herself, but the words hung in the air between us, heavy and terrible. And I what? I demanded. Say it. Whatever you're thinking, just say it. But she wouldn't. She got into the car and my father followed like a whipped dog. The engine started and they drove away, leaving me standing in the church parking lot with papers that proved they'd betrayed me and no explanation why. Mommy! I'd almost forgotten Ethan was there. He'd been so quiet, standing slightly behind me watching his grandmother reject us again. Yes, baby. Does Grandma love us? The question pierced straight through my heart. I wanted to lie, wanted to tell him of course she did, that this was all just a misunderstanding, that family meant something. But I couldn't force the words past my lips. I don't know, I finally said, and hated myself for the honesty. She doesn't, Ethan said with the brutal clarity of childhood. If she loved us, she wouldn't make us sleep in the car. He was right. And standing there in that church parking lot watching my parents drive away while their pastor waved goodbye with a smile, I realized something. Love had failed me. Family had failed me. The bonds of blood and shared history meant nothing when tested against whatever hold my mother had over my father, whatever debt he claimed to owe. If love couldn't protect me, maybe the law could. I pulled out my phone and started searching for lawyers who handled property fraud, but I didn't know the law had already been bought. I called 17 lawyers before I found one who would see me without a retainer I couldn't afford. Most wanted $2,000 just to review my case. $2,000 I didn't have because I'd spent my last savings on the house that was no longer mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. The 18th lawyer was different. His secretary said he'd see me that same afternoon, no charge for the consultation. His name was Gerald Harris, and his office was in one of those old Victorian houses downtown that had been converted into professional suites, the kind of place that smelled like lemon polish and old paper. Harris was waiting for me in a book-lined office that felt more like a library than a workplace. He was perhaps 65 with silver hair combed neatly back and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly air. When he stood to shake my hand, his grip was warm and firm. "Miss Williams," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his mahogany desk. "Please sit. My secretary said you have a property dispute involving your parents." "You could call it that," I said, my voice more bitter than I intended. "They forged my signature and stole my house." His eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite an accusation. Tell me everything." So I did. The whole sordid story spilled out: the foreclosure, the $80,000, the promises, the betrayal. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, his expression thoughtful and sympathetic. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "Your parents are David and Ruth Williams," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Do you know them?" "I was your father's lawyer 20 years ago," he said. "Handled some business contracts for his construction company. Good man, your father. At least I thought he was." Something about the way he said it made me feel less alone. Here was someone who understood someone who saw the injustice of it all. "Can you help me?" I asked, and I hated how desperate I sounded. "I can," he said. "And I will. Your case is straightforward: forgery, fraud, breach of contract. The forged signature alone is enough to invalidate the deed transfer." He paused, tapping his pen against the legal pad. "But I have to warn you, litigation like this is expensive. We're looking at months of legal work, possibly a trial. Most firms would want a retainer of at least $10,000. My heart sank. I don't have that kind of money. I spent everything saving the house. "I know." He set down his pen and looked at me with something that might have been kindness. "Which is why I'm offering to take your case pro bono, out of old loyalty to your father before he became whatever he is now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Pro bono? You'd represent me for free?" "Consider it my small act of justice in an unjust world," he said. "Your parents wronged you. Someone should stand up for what's right." I felt tears prick my eyes. For the first time in weeks, someone was on my side. Someone believed me. "There is one thing I need to ask you," Harris said, leaning forward slightly. "This Edward Morrison who donated the $40,000. What do you know about him?" "Nothing really. My father mentioned him at church, said he owed him a debt." "Why?" Harris's expression grew distant, almost sad. "Edward was an old friend of your father's. They grew up together, actually. Edward saved the family once, a long time ago. I handled some legal matters for him as well." "Saved the family from what?" "I'm not at liberty to say. Attorney-client privilege even after death." He adjusted his glasses. "Edward died 3 years ago. Heart attack. Your father took it hard." "So the $40,000 really was from Edward?" "It was." Harris pulled a folder from his desk drawer and slid it across to me. "I have the bank records showing the transfer. Edward's estate made the donation shortly before his death. A final gift to an old friend." I stared at the documents, trying to make sense of it all. Then why would my father betray me if Edward gave us that money to save the house? Why would Dad turn around and give it to Susan? "That," Harris said quietly, "is what we need to find out. Now I need you to gather every document you have related to this house. The original deed, the foreclosure notice, any written promises your parents made, bank statements showing your payments. Especially the forged deed transfer. Can you do that? Yes, I made copies of everything. Good. Bring them to me, but, Mary... He leaned forward, his expression suddenly intense. This is very important. You cannot tell anyone about this lawsuit. Not your sister, not your friends, absolutely not your parents. The element of surprise is crucial. If they know what's coming, they'll have time to cover their tracks, destroy evidence, prepare counter-arguments. Do you understand? I understand. I'm serious, he pressed. Not a word to anyone. People talk even when they don't mean to. One casual conversation, one offhand comment, and everything could fall apart. Can you keep this completely confidential? There was something almost urgent in the way he asked, but I attributed it to professional caution. Lawyers were probably always worried about their cases being compromised. I won't tell anyone, I promised. Excellent. He stood extending his hand again. Behind him, I noticed a framed photograph on the credenza Harris with another man, both younger, both smiling. The other man's face was partly obscured by glare on the glass. Is that Edward? I asked, nodding toward the photo. Harris glanced back at it and something flickered across his face. Yes, taken many years ago. He was a good friend. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. He walked me to the door. I'll start drafting the complaint this week. We'll file within the month. Your parents will be served with papers, and then we'll see how they respond when they're forced to answer for what they've done. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Finally, someone was fighting for me. Finally, I had hope. I trusted him completely. After all, he was the only one who seemed to care. The invitation came 3 weeks after I'd met with Harris, delivered via text message with the kind of false cheerfulness that made my skin crawl. Mary, why don't you and Ethan come by the house this Saturday? I'd love for you to see what we've done with the place. 2 p.m. I stared at the message for a full minute, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to block her number, to pretend Susan didn't exist. But Ethan had been asking about his things, his books, his toys, the model airplane we'd been building together before we were thrown out. And despite everything, some small, stupid part of me hoped that maybe Susan felt guilty. Maybe she wanted to make amends. I should have known better. We arrived at 2 o'clock sharp. The house looked different already. New shutters painted a crisp white. The lawn professionally landscaped, an expensive wreath hanging on the door that had once been mine. Susan answered wearing yoga pants and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than I made in a week, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail. Mary, Ethan, she pulled me into a hug that felt like hugging a mannequin. I'm so glad you could make it. Come in, come in. The interior had been gutted. The worn hardwood floors I'd grown up on had been replaced with gleaming tile. The wallpaper my mother had hung in 1985 was gone. The walls now painted in trendy grays and whites. Even the smell was different, not the familiar scent of my mother's cooking and my father's coffee, but something artificial and floral from a plug-in air freshener. What do you think? Susan asked, gesturing around like a realtor showing off a property. We've done so much work. Had to bring everything up to date, you know. It was so dated before. It was home before, I said quietly. She either didn't hear me or pretended not to. Come see the kitchen. We knocked down the wall to the dining room, opened up the whole space. Much better flow. She led us through room after room, each one transformed beyond recognition. The kitchen where I'd learned to bake cookies was now all stainless steel and granite. The living room where we'd watched movies on Friday nights had been stripped of furniture and turned into what Susan called a meditation space. My parents' bedroom was now a master suite with a walk-in closet bigger than the room Ethan and I were renting at the extended stay motel. And now, Susan said, her smile widening, the upstairs. Ethan's hand tightened in mine. He'd been quiet through the whole tour, but I could feel the tension in his small body. He knew what was coming. We climbed the stairs, newly carpeted of course, and Susan pushed open the door to what had been Ethan's room for 8 years. The blue walls he'd picked out himself were now pink. His twin bed with the astronaut sheets was gone, replaced by a white canopy bed fit for a princess. His bookshelf, his desk, his toy chest, all of it erased. "This is Emma's room now," Susan said, beaming. "She just loves it. Much more appropriate for a little girl, don't you think?" "Where are my things?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "Oh, that." Susan waved her hand dismissively. "Well, we needed the space, obviously. Most of it we donated to Goodwill, but I did save a few items for you." She pulled a cardboard box from the closet and set it on the floor. I watched Ethan kneel down and open it. Inside were a handful of books, some worn stuffed animals, and the pieces of the model airplane we'd been building together. The wings had been snapped off. "What happened to it?" Ethan whispered, holding up the broken pieces. "Oh, that was already broken when we found it," Susan said breezily. "You should have been more careful with your toys." "It wasn't broken. We'd been so close to finishing it. I'd planned to help him complete it the weekend after we were locked out." "Everything else?" I asked, my voice tight. "All his toys, his books, his clothes?" "Like I said, Goodwill. We needed space for important things." Susan smiled at Ethan. "You understand, don't you, sweetie? You're a big boy now. You don't need all those baby toys anymore." I watched my son carefully place the broken airplane back in the box, his face carefully blank in that way children learn when they're trying not to cry in front of adults who've hurt them. And suddenly, I was 27 again, standing in my apartment watching Susan smile that same smile as she told me she was dating my fiancé. "You weren't right for him anyway," she'd said. "He needs someone more fun. You're so serious all the time, Mary." Jake had proposed to me on my birthday. 6 months later, Susan had him. A year after that, they were married. She wore white, and I wasn't invited to the wedding. I was in love with him first. I'd told my mother, crying in her kitchen. "Susan needs him more," my mother had replied. "You're strong. You'll find someone else." But I never did. And now Susan had my house just like she'd taken my fiancé, smiling that same sweet, innocent smile while she destroyed everything I'd built. "Thank you for the tour," I said, keeping my voice level. "We should go." "Oh, already? Well, come back any time." Susan walked us to the door. "It's so nice that we can all be civil about this. Family is family, after all." She hugged me again, and I felt her whisper in my ear. "He would have left you anyway. Just like Mom would have given me the house eventually. I just helped it along." I pulled back and looked at her. Really looked at her. At that smile that had haunted me for 10 years. The smile that said she could take whatever she wanted, and I would just accept it, because that's what I'd always done. She smiled the same way she did when she stole my fiancé. But this time I wasn't going to forgive quietly. That night after Ethan finally fell asleep, clutching the box of broken toys, I sat in our motel room and let myself remember. Not just the house, not just Jake, but all of it. Every time Susan had taken something from me. Every time my parents had looked the other way. Every time I'd swallowed my hurt and stayed silent, because that's what good daughters did. The pattern started long before I understood what a pattern was. I was 17, a senior at Lincoln High School, when I won the Riverside Scholarship, full ride to State University tuition room board books. Everything. It was awarded to one student per year based on academic merit and a personal essay about overcoming adversity. I'd written about being the daughter of a struggling contractor, about working weekends at the diner to help with family expenses, about wanting to be the first person in my family to graduate from college. Principal Hayes called me into his office on a Friday afternoon in April 1995. I can still remember the smell of his Old Spice cologne, the way the afternoon sun streamed through his window, the weight of his hand on my shoulder as he congratulated me. "The committee was unanimous, Mary. Your essay was exceptional. Your grades speak for themselves. You're going to do great things." I floated through the rest of that day, My English teacher, Mrs. Wilson, hugged me in the hallway. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You earned this." I told my parents at dinner that night. Susan was 14, sitting across from me, pushing peas around her plate. My father nodded, said, "That's good," and went back to his meatloaf. My mother smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "How wonderful," she said. "Your sister applied for that scholarship too." "I know, but they only give it to seniors." Susan's fork clattered against her plate. "It's not fair," she said, her voice rising. "You always get everything. You're always the perfect one." "Susan, it's a merit scholarship. Mary earned it with her grades and her essay." "Whatever." Susan shoved back from the table and ran upstairs. I heard her bedroom door slam. My mother sighed. "Did you have to tell us at dinner you know how sensitive your sister is?" That should have been my first warning. On Monday morning, I was called back to Principal Hayes's office. This time there was no smile, no hand on my shoulder. He sat behind his desk, my scholarship application in front of him, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years over the weekend. "Mary, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course." "Did you plagiarize your scholarship essay?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "What?" "No, I wrote every word myself. Mrs. Wilson can tell you she helped me edit it." "Your sister came to see me this morning," he said quietly. "She brought evidence that you copied large portions of your essay from an article published in Reader's Digest 3 years ago." "That's not true. I never, Principal Hayes. I swear to you I wrote that essay myself. Every single word." He slid a photocopy across the desk. It was an article about a young woman from a poor family who worked her way through college. Some of the phrases were similar to mine. We'd both used the word perseverance. Both described financial hardship, but that's where the similarity ended. "This isn't plagiarism," I said, my hands shaking. "These are just common phrases. Anyone writing about the same topic would use similar language." "The scholarship committee disagrees. I'm sorry, Mary, but we have to revoke the award. We can't give it to someone who's been accused of academic dishonesty." "But I didn't do anything wrong. This is just Susan being jealous. She's lying." "Your sister seemed very credible, and very upset that she had to turn in her own sister." He stood, signaling the meeting was over. "I'm sorry. The decision is final." I went straight to Mrs. Wilson's classroom. She was erasing the blackboard, getting ready for her next period class. When she saw my face, she set down the eraser immediately. "Mary, what's wrong?" I told her everything. She listened, her expression growing darker with each word. "That's ridiculous," she said flatly. "You wrote that essay in my classroom. I watched you write it. I helped you revise 3 drafts. She grabbed a piece of school letterhead from her desk and started writing furiously. "I'm writing a letter to Principal Hayes right now. This is absurd." "Will it help?" She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. "Honestly, I don't know. Once they've made a decision about plagiarism, they rarely reverse it. The politics are complicated, but I'm going to try." She did try. She wrote a detailed letter explaining how she'd supervised my entire writing process, how she could personally vouch for my integrity, how the so-called evidence was flimsy at best. She sent copies to Principal Hayes, to the scholarship committee, to the superintendent. It didn't matter. The scholarship went to someone else. I never went to college. I couldn't afford it without that money, and by the time I'd saved enough for community college, I was pregnant with Ethan and Jake was gone. Mrs. Wilson gave me a copy of her letter before I graduated. "Keep this," she said, pressing it into my hands. "Someday you might need proof that you were telling the truth." I kept it for 23 years. It was in a manila envelope in my car right now, along with all my other important documents. I'd never forgotten it, never thrown it away, even when it seemed pointless to hold on to. The worst part wasn't losing the scholarship, though. The worst part was what happened when I went home and confronted Susan. "You lied," I screamed at her. "You cost me a full scholarship because you were jealous." "I didn't lie," Susan said calmly. "You did copy that article. I remember seeing it on your desk." "That's not true, and you know it." My parents appeared in the doorway. I turned to them, desperate for someone to believe me. "Mom, Dad, Susan lied to the principal. She made up a story about me plagiarizing my essay because she didn't want me to win the scholarship. You have to believe me." My mother looked between us, her face troubled. My father stood behind her, silent as always. "Mary," my mother said finally, "maybe this is for the best." "What? Susan is younger. She needs opportunities too. You're the older one. You should let your sister win sometimes." Let her win. This isn't a game. This was my future. She lied and destroyed it. "Don't be so dramatic," my mother said. "You'll find another way to go to college." But I never did. I remember my father coming into my room later that night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my eyes swollen from crying. He sat on the edge of my bed, and I could smell whiskey on his breath. "I'm sorry." He said, his words slightly slurred. "Your mother, she loves Susan more. Always has." "Why?" I whispered. "Because you're not." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind. I shouldn't have said anything. Because I'm not what—" He stood up, swaying slightly. "Because you're not my daughter." The words hung in the air between us. I was too young, too hurt, to understand what he really meant. I thought he was saying I wasn't good enough, that I'd disappointed him so badly he was disowning me. "I hate you," I whispered. He left without another word. The next morning he acted like the conversation never happened, and I was too afraid to bring it up, too scared of what else he might say. For 23 years I carried that wound. I let Susan take things from me. I stayed quiet when my parents chose her over me again and again. I convinced myself it was my fault that I wasn't worthy of being fought for. But sitting in that motel room watching my son sleep with his broken toys, I finally understood something. My father's drunken words weren't about disappointment. They were about something else entirely, something he'd been too much of a coward to explain. And Mrs. Wilson's letter wasn't just a testament to my innocence about plagiarism. It was proof of a pattern. Proof that Susan had been sabotaging me for decades. Proof that would matter in court when I needed to show that the forged signature and stolen house weren't isolated incidents, but part of a lifetime of betrayal. This time I wasn't that scared 17-year-old girl anymore. This time I had proof, and I had rage. The motel kicked us out in March when my credit card was declined. I'd been juggling payments, robbing Peter to pay Paul, stretching every dollar until it screamed. But there's only so much juggling you can do when you're working as many shifts as the hospital will give you and still can't make ends meet. The extended stay manager was apologetic but firm. We had 24 hours to vacate. So we went back to the car. 3 weeks we lived in that Honda Civic, parked in different locations each night to avoid being noticed. The Walmart parking lot. The hospital employee lot, where I could at least use the staff bathroom to wash up. The public library parking garage. We became experts at invisibility, at pretending we weren't homeless, at maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. Ethan stopped complaining after the first few days. That scared me more than anything. 10-year-old boys shouldn't be that resigned, that accepting of sleeping in a back seat with a rolled-up jacket for a pillow. He did his homework by dome light. He ate granola bars for dinner without asking when we'd have a real meal. He stopped asking when we could go home. I'd broken something in my son, and I didn't know how to fix it. It was a Tuesday morning in early April when Ellen Carter found us. I'd parked on Maple Street the night before, unable to help myself. I kept being drawn back to the house like a ghost haunting the scene of its own death. I woke up at 6 to Ellen tapping on my window, her face creased with concern. "Mary, is that you?" I rolled down the window, too tired to be embarrassed. Ellen had lived next door to my parents for as long as I could remember. She'd given me cookies when I was little, had attended my high school graduation, had sent a baby gift when Ethan was born. "Hi, Ellen. Are you sleeping in your car?" Her eyes moved to the back seat where Ethan was still curled up under my nursing jacket. "Oh, honey, how long has this been going on?" "A few weeks." My voice cracked. "The motel was too expensive. And your parents just let this happen. Ruth knows you're living in your car. Ruth is the reason I'm living in my car." Ellen's expression shifted from concern to something harder. She glanced at my parents' house, at the new shutters and the expensive wreath, then back at me. "Come on," she said. "Both of you. You're staying with me." "Ellen, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm telling. I have a guest room that hasn't been used since my daughter moved to Portland. You and Ethan will stay there until you figure things out." She pulled open my car door. "Now come on before Ruth looks out her window and sees us talking." Ellen's house was small but immaculately kept, full of photos of her grandchildren and the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls. She set us up in the guest room, brought us fresh towels, and insisted on making breakfast while I showered for the first time in 3 days. Standing under that hot water, I cried so hard I had to stuff a washcloth in my mouth to keep from being heard. We stayed quiet about our arrangement. Ellen insisted on it. "Ruth still thinks we're friends," she said. "It's better if we keep it that way for now." At first, I didn't understand why Ellen's friendship with my mother mattered. Then one evening, about a week after we'd moved in, Ellen called me into her kitchen after Ethan had gone to bed. "There's something you need to know," she said, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Something I've been wrestling with for a long time now." "What is it?" She got up and retrieved an old cassette recorder from a drawer, the kind with the built-in microphone that people used to use for dictation. The kind I hadn't seen in years. "I still use this for recording reminders to myself," she said. "Grocery lists, things I need to tell my daughter when I call her, that sort of thing. My memory isn't what it used to be." She set it on the table between us. In April 2016, almost 2 years ago, I was sitting on my back porch recording a shopping list. Ruth and Susan were in your parents' backyard, and they didn't know I could hear them. I didn't mean to record their conversation, but this thing picks up everything. My heart started beating faster. "What did they say?" Ellen pressed play. The audio was scratchy, the voices distant but clear enough. I heard my mother's voice first. "So, you're sure you want to do this? Once we change the locks, there's no going back." "I'm sure." Susan's voice was firm, confident. "The house should be mine anyway. I have 3 kids, she only has 1, and she's hardly ever there, always working double shifts at the hospital." "What kind of mother does that—" "She works those shifts to help us," my mother said, but her voice was weak, uncertain. "She works those shifts because she has to. Because she's a single mother who made bad choices. I'm married. I'm stable. My children need this house more than Ethan does." There was a long pause. Then my mother spoke again, and her voice was different. Harder. "You're right. Mary is strong. She'll find a way. She always does. But you need help, and family helps family." "So, we're agreed. We do it in October, after she's had time to settle back into her routine. That way, it won't seem planned." "October," my mother confirmed. "We'll tell her together. United front. She'll be upset, but she'll get over it. She always does." The recording ended. I sat there frozen, my mind struggling to process what I'd just heard. "They planned it," I whispered. "A year and a half before they locked us out. They sat in the backyard and planned the whole thing." "I know," Ellen said quietly. "I've listened to this recording 100 times since then, trying to decide what to do about it. You have to give this to my lawyer. This is proof. This proves they planned to evict me long before they did it. This shows premeditation." "I can't." Ellen's voice was pained. "Mary Ruth and I have been friends for 40 years. We raised our children together. We've been through divorces and deaths and everything in between. I can't just betray her. She betrayed me, her own daughter. I know. And it's wrong. What they did to you is unforgivable." Ellen reached across the table and gripped my hand. But I'm 72 years old, and Ruth is one of the only friends I have left. If I give you this recording, she'll never speak to me again. I'll lose her." "So you're choosing her over what's right?" "No." Ellen's voice was firm. "I'm choosing to testify in court. When your case goes to trial, I'll take the stand and I'll tell the judge everything I heard. I'll tell the truth under oath. But I can't give you the recording to use before then. I can't be the one to attack her first. Do you understand?" I didn't, not really. But I also understood that Ellen had already done more for me than anyone else had. She'd given me and Ethan a place to sleep, food to eat, and hope that justice might actually exist. "Will you really testify?" I asked. "I will. When the time comes, I'll tell the truth. I promise you that." "Thank you," I whispered. Ellen patted my hand. "You're a good mother, Mary. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That night, lying in a real bed with my son safe in the room next to mine, I felt something like hope for the first time in months. Ellen's testimony could change everything. A neighbor with no reason to lie, with actual evidence of my mother and sister planning my eviction. Harris would know how to use this. We could win. Ellen's testimony could change everything. But I didn't know then that Ellen would die before the trial. The phone call came on a Thursday evening in mid-May. I almost didn't answer when I saw my mother's name on the screen. We hadn't spoken since that confrontation at church 6 months ago. But something made me pick up. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the small part of me that still hoped she might actually apologize. "Mary..." Her voice sounded tired, older than I remembered. "It's Mom." "I know." There was a long pause. I heard her take a breath, the kind people take before saying something difficult. "I'm calling because I'm tired," she said. "Tired of this fighting. Tired of not seeing my grandson. Tired of what's happened to our family." Another pause. "I'm 73 years old, Mary. I don't have time to waste on grudges anymore." I said nothing, waiting. "I want to have dinner, you and Ethan, this Saturday at 6. Nothing formal, just family dinner like we used to have. I want my daughters back." Her voice cracked slightly. "I want to fix this before it's too late." Every instinct screamed at me that this was a trap. My mother had never apologized for anything in her life. She didn't suddenly grow a conscience at 73, but Harris had filed the lawsuit 2 weeks ago. The papers had been served. My parents knew legal action was coming, and maybe, just maybe, they were finally realizing what they'd done. Or maybe they wanted to see what evidence I had. "Will Susan be there?" I asked. "Yes, and your father, the whole family." "Please, Mary, let's at least try to talk." I thought about Ellen's recording, about Mrs. Wilson's letter, about the forged signature on the deed transfer. I thought about Harris telling me to keep everything confidential. Then I thought about my son, who still asked sometimes when he could see his grandparents. "Okay," I said. "We'll come." "Thank you." She sounded genuinely relieved, which made me even more suspicious. 6 o'clock Saturday. I'll make pot roast your favorite." She hung up before I could tell her pot roast hadn't been my favorite in 20 years. Saturday arrived cold and rainy, as if the weather itself was warning me. I dressed carefully, not too nice, not too casual. I wanted to look like someone who was willing to reconcile, but not desperate for it. I put my phone in my pocket voice recorder app ready. If they were going to try to manipulate me, I'd at least have proof. Ethan was nervous in the car. "Do you think Grandma really wants to say sorry?" "I don't know, baby, but we're going to find out." The house looked the same as it had during Susan's cruel tour, but now the windows glowed warm with light, and I could see movement inside. My mother opened the door before we could knock, wearing an apron and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mary, Ethan, come in out of the rain." The smell of pot roast filled the house, along with fresh bread and something chocolate baking in the oven. My mother had pulled out all the stops, set the dining room table with her good china, the kind we only used for holidays. Susan was already there, arranging flowers in a vase, wearing a soft pink sweater and a warm smile. "Mary, I'm so glad you came." She hugged me, and I forced myself not to stiffen. "And Ethan, you've grown so much." This wasn't the Susan from the house tour. This was a different performance entirely. My father sat at the head of the table silent as always, but he looked even more haggard than he had at church. His hands shook slightly as he picked up his water glass. When he saw me, something passed across his face. Guilt, maybe, or shame. "Hi, Dad." He nodded but didn't speak. Susan kept finding reasons to refill my wine glass throughout dinner. "It's a new bottle I picked up. You have to try it." And later, "Let me top that off for you." And again, "The bottle's almost empty anyway, might as well finish it." I took small sips but poured most of it into the potted plant beside the table when Susan wasn't looking. If they were trying to get me drunk and loose-lipped, they'd have to try harder. My mother dominated the conversation, chattering about nothing: the weather, the church bake sale, Susan's daughter's piano recital. Anything except the lawsuit, the house, the betrayal. It was surreal sitting at that table pretending the past year hadn't happened. Then, as dessert was being served, my mother's voice shifted. "I want to talk about what happened," she said, setting down her fork. "I want to explain." Here it comes, I thought. "We never meant to hurt you, Mary. You have to believe that." Her eyes were suddenly wet with tears. "Susan needed the house. She has 3 children, a husband who travels for work. She needed stability. And you've always been so strong, so independent. We thought you could manage on your own. So you forged my signature and threw us out." My voice was calm, but my hand tightened around my wine glass. "We didn't forge anything," Susan interjected smoothly. "You must have signed that paperwork and forgotten. You were so stressed back then, working all those double shifts." I stared at her. She was actually trying to gaslight me into believing I'd signed away my own house. "I never signed that transfer document." "Memory is a funny thing," my mother said softly. "Sometimes we forget things when we're under pressure, but that's not what matters now. What matters is family. What matters is forgiveness." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I'm old Mary. I don't want to die with my daughter hating me." It was a masterful performance. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed her. "So what are you asking me to do?" "Drop the lawsuit," Susan said. "Let's handle this as a family, not through lawyers and courts. It's embarrassing having our private business aired in public." There it was, the real reason for the dinner. "Let us come to an arrangement," my mother added. "Maybe Susan can pay you something for your contribution to saving the house. Not 80,000, but something fair. And you can visit any time. Ethan can stay over on weekends. We can be a family again." My father hadn't said a word through any of this. He just sat there staring at his plate, looking like a man at his own funeral. "Can I use your bathroom?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Of course, sweetie," Susan said, pointing toward the hallway. "Second door on the left." While Ethan was gone, my mother leaned forward, her tears drying suspiciously fast. "Please, Mary, think about what a trial would do to this family. Think about Ethan having to watch his grandmother on the witness stand. Is that really what you want?" "What I want," I said carefully, "is what's fair." Susan refilled my wine glass again, even though I'd barely touched it. "We're trying to be fair, but you have to meet us halfway." Ethan came back then, his face pale. He slid into his chair and grabbed my hand under the table, squeezing tight. Something had happened while he was gone, but I couldn't ask with everyone watching. We made it through the rest of dinner with my mother dropping hints about compromise, Susan being aggressively friendly, and my father saying nothing at all. When we finally left, my mother hugged me at the door. "Think about what I said. Family is forever, Mary. Lawsuits end, but family is forever." In the car, I turned to Ethan. "What happened in there?" "I got lost looking for the bathroom," he said quietly. "I heard Aunt Susan talking on her phone in the kitchen. She said, 'Yes, she's here. The plan is working. She's drinking the wine. Give it another hour, and she'll agree to anything.'" My blood ran cold. They'd been trying to get me drunk to manipulate me into dropping the lawsuit while I was emotionally vulnerable and legally impaired. They'd used my mother's fake tears, Susan's false warmth, the trap of nostalgia and family obligation. But they'd underestimated me. I pulled my phone from my pocket, stopped the recording app that had been running since we arrived. Every word, every manipulation, every lie, all documented. They thought I came to reconcile. I came to document everything. Every lie. Every smile. Every betrayal. I met Linda Patterson 3 days after that disastrous dinner at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. She'd left a message on my voicemail introducing herself as a victims' rights attorney who specialized in family abuse cases and offering a free consultation. I almost deleted it, assuming it was some kind of scam, but something about her message felt genuine. She mentioned she'd heard about my case through the courthouse filing system and wanted to help. "I work with women who've been victimized by their own families," she'd said on the recording. "What happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone. Please, call me. I can help." I called back mostly out of desperation. Harris was handling the lawsuit, but he was focused on the legal technicalities, fraud, forgery, property law. He didn't seem to understand the emotional devastation, the betrayal that went deeper than money or deeds. When I tried to explain how it felt to be discarded by my own mother, his eyes glazed over. "Let's stick to the facts that matter in court," he'd say. Linda was waiting at a corner table when I arrived, a slim woman in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled back and a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a blazer, no expensive jewelry, nothing flashy. She looked like someone who worked for a living, not like the polished lawyers in Harris's building. "Mary." She stood and extended her hand. "Linda Patterson, thank you so much for meeting me." "I'm not sure why I'm here," I admitted, shaking her hand. "I already have a lawyer." "I know. Gerald Harris. He's good with property law." She gestured for me to sit. "But I'm not here to replace him. I'm here to support you. What you're going through isn't just a legal battle. It's trauma, and you need someone who understands that." Something in the way she said it made my throat tight. She ordered us both coffee, and as we waited, she pulled out a slim folder. "I've been doing this work for 15 years, she said. "Helping women who've been abused, exploited, or betrayed by family members. Most cases never make it to court because the victims are too scared or too broken to fight. But you're fighting. That takes courage." "I don't feel courageous. I feel angry." "Good. Anger is useful. Anger keeps you moving forward." She leaned back, studying me with eyes that seemed to actually see me. "Can I tell you something personal?" I nodded. "When I was 25, my mother stole my identity. Opened credit cards in my name, took out loans, destroyed my credit. I didn't find out until debt collectors started calling. By then, she'd racked up over $60,000 in my name." "Oh my God." I tried to report it as fraud, but the police said it was a family matter. Banks wouldn't help because technically she was authorized to have my social security number. She was my mother. My own siblings told me I was being dramatic, that family doesn't press charges against family. Her voice cracked slightly. "I lost everything. My apartment, my car, my job when they did a credit check for a promotion. And through it all, everyone kept telling me to forgive her. That's what daughters do." Tears pricked my eyes. "What did you do?" "I went to law school, became the lawyer I needed when I was drowning, and now I help other women who are being told to forgive the unforgivable." She reached across the table and touched my hand. "You don't have to forgive them, Mary. You don't owe them anything." I started crying then, right there in the coffee shop, and Linda handed me napkins and didn't look away or tell me to pull myself together. She just sat there, nodding, understanding. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the legal version, the real version." So I did. I told her about the scholarship Susan stole, about Jake, about the house and the $80,000 and sleeping in my car with Ethan. I told her about my father's drunken words, about Ellen's recording, about the manipulative dinner where they tried to get me drunk. Everything poured out in a rush, all the pain I'd been carrying for months. Linda listened to it all, taking notes occasionally, but mostly just being present in a way no one else had been. "This Edward Morrison," she said when I finished. "The one who donated the 40,000. Tell me more about him." "I don't know much. Harris said he was an old friend of my father's, that he died 3 years ago. My father mentioned owing him a debt, but he wouldn't explain what he meant. And the money, you're certain it came from Edward's estate. Harris showed me the bank records. Why?" "I'm just trying to understand the whole picture." She made another note. "Have you tried to find out more about Edward, about his relationship with your family?" "No, I've been focused on the lawsuit." "It might be worth investigating. Family secrets have a way of mattering in these cases." She tapped her pen against her notepad. "What evidence do you have? I need to know everything so I can help you strategically." I hesitated. Harris had told me to keep everything confidential. Linda seemed to sense my hesitation. "I know Harris probably told you not to discuss the case. But Mary, I'm on your side. I'm not working for the other party. Everything you tell me is protected. And honestly," she lowered her voice, "between you and me, you need to be careful with lawyers like Harris." "What do you mean?" "He's old school, connected. He knows your parents worked with your father years ago. Those kinds of relationships matter. Lawyers can be controlled by money, by old loyalties, by things you don't even know about." She leaned forward. "I'm not saying Harris is dirty, but I am saying you should have someone watching your back. Someone who has no history with your family. Someone who's only loyal to you." It made sense. Harris had seemed genuinely helpful, but Linda was right, he did know my father had worked for him decades ago. What if those old loyalties kicked in when things got difficult? "I have Mrs. Wilson's letter from 1995, I said slowly, "proving Susan lied about the plagiarism. I have the forged deed transfer with my fake signature. And Ellen has a recording of my mother and Susan planning the eviction a year before it happened." Linda's pen moved quickly across her notepad. "Does Ellen plan to testify?" "She said she would. She won't give me the recording beforehand, but she'll testify in court." "That's good. Very good." Linda looked up, her expression warm. "Mary, you have a strong case, but you need to be smart about how you present it. These cases get complicated. Families lawyer up, memories get fuzzy, witnesses change their stories. Ellen wouldn't do that. She promised." "I hope you're right, but in my experience, promises don't always hold up under pressure." She closed her notebook. "Here's what I want you to do. Document everything. Every conversation with your parents, every interaction, every attempt they make to contact you. And keep me in the loop. Call me anytime, day or night. I'll help you navigate this alongside Harris." "You're not charging me anything." "I do pro bono work for cases like yours. Consider it my way of paying forward the help I never got." She smiled, and it seemed so genuine, so kind. "You're not alone anymore, Mary. You have me." We exchanged phone numbers, and she promised to review all my documentation if I wanted to send it to her. As I drove back to Ellen's house, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not just the thin, desperate hope of a lawsuit that might work, but the deeper hope of being believed, being understood, being supported by someone who actually cared. I called Linda that evening and sent her photos of Mrs. Wilson's letter, the forged deed transfer, everything except Ellen's recording since Ellen wouldn't share it. Linda responded within an hour with detailed notes about how each piece of evidence could be used, what additional documentation we might need, how to prepare for depositions. For the first time in months, I felt I wasn't alone. I had no idea she'd been sent to destroy me. Harris called me on the first Monday of June with news I'd been waiting months to hear. "The lawsuit has been filed," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Williams v. Williams and Whitmore. Allegations of fraud, forgery, breach of oral contract, and unjust enrichment. I filed it this morning. Your parents will be served within 48 hours." I was at work standing in the hospital break room with a cup of terrible coffee growing cold in my hands. "When's the court date?" Judge Brennan set it for September 16th. That gives us 3 months to prepare conduct discovery, take depositions. It's a solid timeline. 3 months. 90 days until I could stand in front of a judge and present every piece of evidence, every betrayal, every lie. 90 days until justice. What happens now? I asked. Now we wait for their response. They have 30 days to file an answer to the complaint. Then we'll begin discovery. That's when we request documents, take depositions, gather evidence. I'll need you to be available for your deposition probably sometime in July. I'll be there. Good. And Mary... He paused. Prepare yourself. This is going to get ugly. Family lawsuits always do. Your parents will fight back and they won't fight fair. He was right. 2 weeks later, Susan filed a countersuit. Not against me and Harris both. The filing alleged defamation, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of process. Susan claimed I'd fabricated the entire story about forged signatures and broken promises because I was jealous of her stable family life and wanted money I hadn't earned. Linda called me within hours of the filing. Have you seen it? Harris just emailed me a copy. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the document. She's saying I made everything up, that I signed the deed transfer willingly, and now I'm trying to extort them. It's a standard defense tactic, Linda said, her voice calm and professional. When you can't defend the facts, attack the accuser's credibility. They're trying to paint you as vindictive and greedy. But I have proof. The signature isn't even mine. I know, and the judge will see that. But Susan's not trying to convince the judge right now, she's trying to convince the community. She's playing to public opinion. Linda was right about that too. By the end of the week, the local newspaper had picked up the story. Local family torn apart by property dispute, read the headline accompanied by a photo of my mother's house, my house looking peaceful and all-American in the summer sunshine. The article was supposedly balanced, presenting both sides of the conflict. It quoted Harris describing the forged signature and my $80,000 payment. But it also quoted Susan's lawyer, a slick attorney named Marcus Webb, who'd driven up from the city specifically to handle her countersuit. Ms. Whitmore is devastated by these baseless accusations, Webb was quoted as saying. Her sister has a history of mental health struggles and financial instability. This lawsuit is nothing more than an attempt to capitalize on our client's success and generosity. We will vigorously defend against these slanderous claims. Mental health struggles, financial instability. They were painting me as unstable as a failed single mother lashing out at her more successful sister. Never mind that my so-called financial instability came from paying $80,000 to save their house. Never mind that my mental health struggles, if you could call grief and betrayal, that were caused by them. The article mentioned that Susan was a stay-at-home mother of 3 active in the PTA and the church choir. It mentioned that my mother was a pillar of the community known for her volunteer work and her faith. And me, I was described as a single mother working as a nurse currently staying with a neighbor after reportedly becoming homeless. They made it sound like I was homeless because of my own failures, not because my family had literally locked me out of the house I'd paid to save. The comments section online was vicious. Half the town seemed to think I was a money-grubbing opportunist trying to steal from my poor elderly mother. The other half defended me, pointing out that you don't forge signatures if you have nothing to hide, that working double shifts as a single parent was admirable, not shameful. Your mom did so much for this community, and this is how you repay her. One comment read, disgusting. Families are supposed to stick together. Another replied, her mom forged her signature and stole her house. How is that sticking together? It went on and on. Neighbors I'd known my whole life took sides. The woman who'd taught my Sunday school class shared the article with a crying emoji and a comment about how families should resolve things privately. The charge nurse at the hospital, who'd always been kind to me, left a supportive comment defending my character. I stopped reading after the first few dozen. It was too painful seeing my life dissected by people who didn't know the whole story, who'd made up their minds based on a single newspaper article. Ellen was furious. They're making Ruth look like a saint, she said, pacing her kitchen. Everyone's forgotten how she treated you growing up, how Susan always got everything while you got nothing. They don't know about that. All they see is a respected elder versus an angry daughter. Then tell them. Tell them about the scholarship. Tell them about Jake. Tell them everything. I can't. I thought about Harris's advice about Linda's warnings. If I start talking publicly, they'll use it against me. They'll say I'm trying to manipulate public opinion. I have to let the evidence speak in court. But staying silent was torture. Every time I went to work, I felt people staring. Some were sympathetic, offering quiet support in break rooms and empty hallways. Others were cold, their judgment obvious in turned backs and whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. The worst was seeing my mother at the grocery store. She was with her church group laughing about something, looking healthy and happy and completely unburdened by guilt. When she saw me, her face went carefully blank. Her friends looked between us, avid with curiosity about the family drama they'd been following in the paper. I turned my cart around and left without buying anything. Linda called me almost daily during those weeks, checking in, offering support, helping me prepare for the deposition Harris had scheduled for mid-July. She reviewed my timeline of events, helped me organize my documentation, gave me advice about how to stay calm under aggressive questioning. "Susan's lawyer is going to try to rattle you," she warned. "He'll ask about your relationship with Ethan's father, about your finances, about anything he can use to make you look unstable or irresponsible. Don't let him get to you." "I'll try." "You'll do more than try. You'll be perfect, because you're telling the truth, and the truth is on your side." Harris was less reassuring. When I met with him to prepare for the deposition, he seemed distracted, checking his phone repeatedly, cutting our meeting short because of another commitment he'd forgotten about. "Are you okay?" I asked. "You seem stressed." "Just busy," he said, waving it off. "Big caseload right now. But don't worry about your case, it's solid. The forged signature alone should win it." Should, not would. Should. But I pushed the doubt away. I had Harris. I had Linda. I had evidence. I had Ellen ready to testify, and Mrs. Wilson's letter proving a pattern of betrayal going back decades. The court would decide in 3 months. But I didn't know that before then, everything would collapse. The first hearing was scheduled for September 21st, a preliminary session where both sides would present opening arguments and the judge would review initial evidence. Harris had assured me it was mostly procedural, nothing dramatic, just the formal beginning of our case. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one I saved for job interviews and funerals, and tried to ignore the way my hands shook as I walked into the courthouse. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, less like the dramatic TV versions, and more like a tired government office with wood paneling and fluorescent lights. My parents sat on the opposite side with Susan and her lawyer Marcus Webb, all of them dressed impeccably. My mother wore pearls. Susan had her hair professionally styled. They looked like the respectable family, and I looked like exactly what I was, a working single mother who'd slept in her car. Judge Brennan was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and reading glasses that she peered over to examine both parties. She had the air of someone who'd seen every kind of family dysfunction and wasn't impressed by any of it. Harris stood and delivered his opening statement outlining the case clearly and methodically. The forged signature, the $80,000, the broken promises. He presented the deed transfer document with my supposedly signed name, then called his first witness, a forensic document examiner named Dr. Patricia Chen. Dr. Chen was crisp and professional, walking the judge through her analysis of the signature. She'd examined the deed transfer, compared it to my actual signature on dozens of other documents, and her conclusion was unequivocal. The signature on the deed transfer is not consistent with Ms. Williams's authenticated signatures, she testified. The letter formations, pen pressure, and overall style are markedly different. In my professional opinion, this signature was not written by Mary Williams. I watched my mother's face as Dr. Chen testified. She remained perfectly still, perfectly composed, but I saw my father flinch. He sat between my mother and Susan, his face gray, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair like he might fall without them. Then Marcus Webb stood for his cross-examination. And I understood what Linda had warned me about. He didn't challenge Dr. Chen's findings directly. He couldn't because they were scientifically sound. Instead, he pivoted. Dr. Chen, is it possible that Ms. Williams signed this document during a period of extreme stress or fatigue, which might account for the signature variation? Unlikely to this degree, but theoretically possible. And is it also possible that someone might deliberately alter their own signature to later claim forgery? Harris objected, and Judge Brennan sustained it, but the seed was planted. Webb moved on, abandoning Dr. Chen to deliver his own opening statement. Your Honor, this case isn't about a signature. It's about a daughter who abandoned her family for 5 years, who rarely visited her aging parents, who failed to maintain a relationship with her sister, and who now sees an opportunity for financial gain. Webb's voice was smooth, sympathetic. The Williams family generously allowed Ms. Williams and her son to live in their home rent-free for years. When they made the difficult decision to offer that space to Ms. Whitmore's larger family, Ms. Williams retaliated with this lawsuit. She's attempting to weaponize the legal system against her own mother. That's not true, I whispered to Harris. Stay calm, he whispered back. The evidence will show that Ms. Williams has a history of conflict with her family, Webb continued, that she distanced herself by choice, that her financial difficulties are the result of her own decisions, and that this lawsuit is nothing more than vindictive. My father made a sound. A small gasp, barely audible, but I heard it because I was listening for any crack in their united front. I looked across the courtroom and saw him gripping his chest, his face contorting. Dad? He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. He grabbed the table for support, his breathing rapid and shallow. My mother turned toward him, her composed mask finally cracking into alarm. David! David! What's wrong? He collapsed. Everything happened at once. Susan screamed. Judge Brennan called for a recess and someone to call 911. I was moving before I consciously decided to crossing the courtroom, dropping to my knees beside my father where he'd fallen between the rows of seats. Dad, I'm a nurse, let me help. I loosened his tie, checked his pulse racing irregular. Classic signs of cardiac arrest. Someone get me an AED. Don't touch him. My mother tried to push me away, but I held firm. Mom, I'm trying to help him. He's having a heart attack. My father's eyes found mine, and for the first time in years, I saw him really looking at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. His lips moved, forming words I had to lean close to hear. Find Edward, he gasped. The money. You deserve... Edward's dead dad. Harris told me, no. His hand gripped mine with surprising strength. Not dead, never dead. She lied. Ruth, she lied about everything. What, Dad? What are you saying? The house was supposed to be yours. Edward wanted... He gasped, his face going gray. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You're his... David, stop talking. My mother's voice was sharp with panic. She grabbed his other hand, her face white. Save your strength, the ambulance is coming. Tell her, my father whispered, but he was looking at my mother now, not me. She deserves to know. About Edward. About everything. There's nothing to tell, my mother said, but her voice shook. You're confused. You're sick. The paramedics arrived then, professional and efficient, taking over the situation. They loaded my father onto a stretcher, started an IV attached monitors. My mother climbed into the ambulance with him, and just before the doors closed, she looked back at me. The expression on her face wasn't grief or fear, it was rage. The ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, and I stood in the courthouse parking lot feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Susan was crying, surrounded by her lawyer and several church friends who'd come to support them. A local news camera was filming everything. Susan saw the camera and walked toward it, tears streaming down her face. I watched in horror as she spoke to the reporter, her voice breaking with theatrical grief. My father just had a heart attack in that courtroom because of the stress my sister put him under. She's destroying our family over money. Over a house that was never hers. And now my father might die because of her greed. The reporter ate it up, asking leading questions. How do you feel about your sister right now? I feel betrayed, heartbroken. We tried to reconcile, tried to find a peaceful solution, but she insisted on dragging us through court. And now look what's happened. My sister destroyed our family for money. The video would be online within an hour. By evening, it would have thousands of views. By morning, I'd be the villain of the story, the ungrateful daughter who stressed her father into a heart attack over a property dispute. But all I could think about was my father's words. Find Edward. Not dead. Never dead. Ruth lied about everything. Harris had told me Edward Morrison died 3 years ago. He'd shown me death records, or at least he'd said he had. But my father's dying words, and they might be dying words, I realized with a chill, told a different story. Linda called me before I even made it back to my car. Mary, I just saw the news. Are you okay? My father collapsed. He's on his way to the hospital. I know. I'm so sorry. But Mary, you need to be very careful right now. Public opinion is turning. That video of Susan is everywhere. People are saying you caused this. I didn't cause anything. They're the ones who forged my signature. They're the ones who... I know, I believe you. But right now you need to focus on damage control. Don't talk to any reporters. Don't post anything on social media. Just stay quiet and let this blow over. My father said something before he collapsed, about Edward Morrison. He said Edward isn't dead, that Ruth lied about everything. There was a pause on Linda's end. What exactly did he say? He told me to find Edward. He said the money was supposed to be mine, that I deserved it. And he started to say something else, something about me being, but he didn't finish. Being what? I don't know. My mother interrupted him. Another pause. Mary, your father just had a heart attack. People say strange things when they're in medical crisis. You can't read too much into confused ramblings. He didn't sound confused. He sounded desperate, like he was trying to tell me something important before it was too late. Just focus on getting through the next few days, Linda said. The hearing will be rescheduled. We'll deal with everything else after your father stabilizes. I hung up and sat in my car, watching Susan still talking to reporters, playing the grieving daughter to perfection. The judge had postponed everything indefinitely, pending my father's condition. Our case was on hold. My reputation was being destroyed in real time on social media. And somewhere out there, if my father was telling the truth, was a man named Edward Morrison, who everyone believed was dead, but apparently wasn't. Dad's last words haunted me, find Edward. But Edward was dead. Or was he? My father survived the heart attack, but barely. He spent 2 weeks in the ICU, then moved to a regular room where my mother kept constant vigil, refusing to let me visit. The nurses told me she'd left explicit instructions that I wasn't to be allowed in. Family only, she'd said, as if I'd ceased to be family the moment I'd filed the lawsuit. So instead of sitting by his bedside, I searched for a dead man. I started with the obvious places. Pine Grove Cemetery, where Harris had said Edward Morrison was buried. I walked through acres of headstones on a cold October morning, checking every Morrison grave. There were 3. Harold Morrison died 1987. Margaret Morrison died 2003. No Edward. I went to the county clerk's office and requested death certificates. The clerk, a tired woman in her 50s, searched the database while I waited. No Edward Morrison death certificate filed in this county, she said. When did you say he died? 2015, that's what I was told. Well, it's not here. Could have died in a different county, or the family might not have filed properly. Happens more than you'd think. But my father's words echoed in my head. Not dead. Never dead. She lied. I tried hospital records, next obituaries, anything that might prove Edward Morrison had actually died. Nothing. It was like he'd simply vanished 3 years ago. Linda was skeptical when I told her what I'd found. Or rather, what you haven't found. Mary, maybe he just moved away. Maybe he's in a nursing home somewhere under a different name. You can't build a theory on absence of evidence. But my father specifically said Edward wasn't dead. That Ruth lied about everything. Your father was having a heart attack. You can't trust what he said. But I did trust it. Maybe because it was the first honest thing my father had said to me in decades. Maybe because I was desperate for any thread to pull that might unravel the whole tangled mess. I took a week's vacation from the hospital and hired someone to help me search. His name was Marcus Reed, no relation to Susan's lawyer, a graduate student in criminal justice, who did private investigation work on the side to pay his tuition. He was 24, methodical, and cheap, which was all I could afford. "You want me to find a guy who maybe didn't die?" he asked when we met at a diner near campus. "I want you to prove he's still alive, or prove he's really dead. Either way, I need to know the truth." Marcus worked fast. Within a week, he'd traced property tax records for Edward Morrison still being paid, still current, for a small house in Riverside County about 50 miles north. The payments came from a checking account that showed regular activity, utility bills in Edward's name, a phone number unlisted but traceable. "Your dead guy pays his electric bill," Marcus said, sliding the printouts across the table. "Either he's not dead, or he's the most responsible ghost I've ever seen." I stared at the address. 2847 Maple Ridge Road, Riverside. A real place. A place where Edward Morrison might actually be living. I should have gone immediately, but I was afraid. Afraid of what I might find or what I might not find. Afraid that this lead would evaporate like all the others, leaving me with nothing but more questions. It was Ellen who finally pushed me to go. I'd been staying with her for months now, and she'd grown frailer over the autumn. The doctors said her heart was failing, that she had maybe 6 months left. She spent most days in her recliner wrapped in Afghans, but her mind was still sharp. "You need to see Edward," she said one evening in late October, "before it's too late." "You knew he was alive." "I suspected. Ruth told everyone he died, but I never saw an obituary, never saw her attend a funeral." Ellen pulled a slip of paper from her pocket with a shaking hand. "I kept his address, just in case." It was the same address Marcus had found. "His wife died in 2010, Ellen continued. "Cancer. After that, Edward just disappeared. Stopped coming around, stopped calling. Your father was devastated. They'd been friends since childhood." She paused, catching her breath. "But Edward didn't die. He just couldn't bear to be around your mother anymore." "Why not?" "That's Edward's story to tell, not mine." She pressed the paper into my hand. "Go see him, Mary. He's been waiting a long time to talk to you." I drove to Riverside on the first Saturday in November. The address led me to a modest ranch house on a quiet street lined with oak trees. The yard was immaculately maintained, full of late-season roses and a vegetable garden preparing for winter. Wind chimes hung from the porch, making soft music in the autumn breeze. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, trying to find the courage to knock on the door. This man had supposedly been my father's best friend. He'd donated $40,000 to save the house. And according to my father's last coherent words, he held the key to understanding everything. Finally, I got out of the car and walked to the front door. Before I could knock, it opened. The man standing there was tall, maybe 6'2", with white hair and clear blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, and he looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. "Mary," he whispered. "My God, you look just like your mother when she was young." "You know who I am? I've been following your case in the papers. The lawsuit, the heart attack, everything." He stepped back, gesturing me inside. "I wondered if you'd find me. Your father knew you would eventually. That's why he was so afraid." The house was warm and comfortable, filled with books and photographs. I saw pictures of a woman I assumed was his late wife, pictures of landscapes and gardens, but no pictures of people I recognized. "How did you know my father?" I asked. "We grew up together. Best friends from the time we were 7 years old. We did everything together, played baseball, chased girls, got in trouble." Edward's smile was sad. We even fell in love with the same woman. My throat tightened. My mother. Your mother. He gestured for me to sit on the couch, then lowered himself into an armchair across from me. Ruth was the most beautiful girl in town. Smart, funny, full of life. We both courted her. We both wanted to marry her. She chose my father. She chose David, yes, but not because she wanted to. Edward's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. Her father made that choice for her. My family was poor. David's father had money connections. So Ruth's father arranged the marriage, and Ruth did what daughters did in those days. She obeyed. But she must have loved him eventually. Did she? Edward looked at me with those clear blue eyes. Or did she just learn to live with her choice? These are questions I've spent 40 years asking myself. The $40,000, I said. You donated it to save the house. Why would you give that much money to a woman who chose someone else? Because it wasn't for Ruth. Edward leaned forward. It was for you. It was always for you. I don't understand. You have your mother's eyes, he said softly. Her cheekbones, her hair. But your smile, Mary, your smile is mine. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the couch, trying to process what he was saying. What? Your father knew. David knew from the moment you were born. He wasn't your father, Mary. I am. The words hung in the air between us, impossible, and yet somehow making perfect sense of everything. My father's drunken confession when I was 17. My mother's lifetime of favoritism toward Susan. The way I'd never quite fit in my own family. No, I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew it was true. Edward's eyes filled with tears. I've been waiting for you, Mary. Your father knew I would tell you everything. That's why he was so afraid. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The room spun around me as Edward's words echoed in my head. I am your father. That's impossible, I finally managed. My mother would have told me. Someone would have told me. Your mother couldn't tell you. She'd built her whole life on the lie that you were David's daughter, and David... Edward's voice broke. David loved you anyway, or tried to, but every time he looked at you, he saw me, saw the proof of Ruth's betrayal. When how? Edward stood and walked to the window looking out at his garden. The summer of 1980. Ruth was 29, married to David for 6 years. They'd been trying to have children and couldn't. The doctor said David had a low sperm count, that natural conception was unlikely. He turned back to me. Ruth came to me one night. She said she couldn't live without a child, that David's family was pressuring them, that she was desperate. She asked me to help her. Help her? Give her what David couldn't. A child. His face was filled with pain. I'd never stopped loving her, Mary. Never. I'd married someone else, tried to move on, but Ruth was always the one. So when she asked, I said yes. Just once, she promised. Just to have a baby. Then we'd never speak of it again. I felt sick. So, I was planned. Conceived deliberately. You were wanted, Edward corrected gently. By your mother, by me. David suspected, but he couldn't prove it. And when you were born, Ruth convinced him you were his. She had to. Her marriage, her reputation, everything depended on that lie. But he knew. He always knew. He knew. Edward sat down again, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. And he loved Susan more because Susan was actually his. The fertility treatments finally worked when Ruth was 34. Susan was the child he'd always wanted, his real daughter. It all made sense now. The favoritism, the scholarship Susan stole while my parents did nothing, the house being given to her instead of me. I'd spent my whole life wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't earn my father's love no matter how hard I tried. And the answer was simple. I wasn't his. The money, I said, forcing myself back to the present. You gave $40,000 to save the house. Why? I gave $80,000, Edward said. The whole amount. I stared at him. But I paid $40,000 from my retirement account. And I reimbursed it. Edward pulled a folder from a drawer in the side table. When I heard the house was being foreclosed on, I contacted David. I told him I'd pay off the bank all of it, but only under one condition. What condition? He opened the folder and pulled out a document yellowed and water-stained but still legible. It was a private contract dated August 15, 2015, signed by both Edward Morrison and David Williams, with a notary seal at the bottom. The condition was that the house would be transferred to you, Edward said. That was the deal. I'd save the house, but it had to become yours. You'd worked so hard, sacrificed so much. You deserved a home. You deserved security. And since I couldn't give you anything openly, couldn't claim you as my daughter, I could at least give you this. I read the contract with shaking hands. It was clear and specific. Edward Morrison agrees to provide $80,000 to satisfy foreclosure proceedings on the property located at 247 Maple Street, with the express condition that said property shall be transferred to Mary Williams within 90 days of payment. Failure to transfer the property as specified will result in immediate repayment of all funds with 10% interest. David signed it, I whispered. He did. He didn't want to. Ruth fought him on it, but he knew he had no choice. Without my money, they'd lose the house, so he signed. But the house was never transferred to me. They gave it to Susan instead. Edward's jaw tightened. Ruth found the contract a week after David signed it. He'd hidden it in his workshop, but she was going through his things suspicious about why he'd suddenly agreed to save the house. When she found it, she destroyed it. Destroyed it? Burned it. That's what David told me later when he called to confess what had happened. Ruth convinced him the contract didn't matter, that I'd never enforce it, that family was more important than legal agreements. Edward gestured to the water-damaged copy in my hands. I kept a duplicate, stored it in a safe deposit box. It got damaged when the bank's basement flooded in 2016, but it's still readable, still legally valid. So you had proof they violated the agreement. Why didn't you sue? Why didn't you do anything? Because David begged me not to. Edward's voice dropped. He called me 2 months after the foreclosure was paid off, crying, telling me Ruth had convinced him to transfer the house to Susan instead. He said if I enforced the contract, Ruth would tell you the truth, that he wasn't your father. He said it would destroy you, destroy everyone. He asked me to let it go for your sake. For my sake? Anger flared hot in my chest. He stole my house and blamed it on protecting me. He was weak, Edward said quietly. He'd always been weak when it came to Ruth. She controlled him, manipulated him, made him feel like he owed her something for staying married to him, even though he couldn't give her children. He could never stand up to her. Edward pulled 2 more documents from the folder. The first was a wire transfer receipt showing $80,000 sent from Edward Morrison's account to the bank holding the foreclosure, dated August 20th, 2015. The second was a handwritten letter, the writing shaky and uneven, dated September 10th, 2018, 1 week before my father's heart attack. David wrote this, Edward said, handing me the letter. He sent it to me after you filed the lawsuit. I think he knew his heart was failing. I think he wanted to confess before it was too late. I read my father's words, tears blurring my vision. Edward, I'm dying. The doctors don't say it, but I feel it in my bones. Before I go, I need to tell the truth. You gave us $80,000 to save the house on condition it go to Mary. I agreed. I signed the contract. But Ruth found it and destroyed it. She convinced me to give the house to Susan instead. I was wrong. I've been wrong about everything. Mary deserves the house. She deserves the truth. She deserves to know you're her real father. I'm sorry I was too much of a coward to tell her myself. Please forgive me. Please tell her I'm sorry. I set down the letter, my hands trembling. He knew he was dying. He tried to tell me in the courtroom. Yes. And Ruth stopped him. Edward's expression hardened. "She's been controlling this narrative for 40 years, Mary. Controlling who knows what, who gets what, who matters, and who doesn't. She gave the house to Susan because Susan is David's biological daughter, and you're not. Everything she's done has been to maintain that hierarchy." I looked at the 3 documents spread out before me. The contract, the wire transfer, the confession letter. Together with the forged signature Dr. Chen had already verified with Ellen's recording of Ruth and Susan planning the eviction with Mrs. Wilson's letter proving a pattern of sabotage, this evidence could win my case, could destroy my mother's lies, could get me the house that should have been mine all along. "If you use this," Edward said quietly, "your mother will never forgive you. The whole town will know she committed adultery. They'll know David wasn't your father. They'll know everything." He paused. "And you might not forgive yourself for exposing her." I thought about my mother's face when my father collapsed in court. Thought about Susan crying for the cameras. Thought about all the years of favoritism and betrayal and lies. "I don't need her forgiveness," I said. "I need justice." Edward smiled sadly. "Then take it. Take all of it. Use every weapon I've given you. But know this, Mary, once you fire this shot, there's no taking it back. Your family will never be the same." My family was never real to begin with. I had the weapon I needed, but Edward warned, "If you use this, your mother will never forgive you, and you might not forgive yourself." I left Edward's house with copies of everything: the contract, the wire transfer receipt, the confession letter. He'd insisted I take the originals too, saying he had backup copies in a safe deposit box, though I noticed his hands shook as he handed them over. These documents were his only leverage, his only proof of the deal he'd made with my father, and he was trusting me with them completely. I called Linda from the car, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and vindication. "I found him. Edward is alive. And Linda, he has everything, proof that he paid the full $80,000 a contract, saying the house had to go to me, even a confession letter from my father. We can win this." "That's incredible," Linda said, and she sounded genuinely excited. "Mary, this changes everything. When can I see the documents?" "I'm driving back now. Can you meet me at Ellen's in an hour?" "I'll be there." Linda arrived exactly on time, carrying her usual leather portfolio and wearing the concerned, supportive expression I'd come to rely on over the past 8 months. She'd been my rock through the public humiliation. The media attacks, the endless waiting while my father recovered, and the court case remained on hold. She called me almost daily, reviewed every piece of evidence, helped me prepare for depositions that kept getting postponed. She'd become more than my legal advisor. She'd become my friend. I showed her everything. She read through each document, carefully making notes, asking questions, her legal mind working through the implications. "This is powerful," she said finally. "The contract alone might not be enough. Private agreements can be challenged, but combined with the wire transfer proof and your father's written confession, plus the forged signature we already have, Mary, this could absolutely win your case." That's what Edward said. "But we need to be strategic about how we use it." Linda tapped her pen against the contract. "Harris doesn't know about this yet, right?" "No, I came straight to you." "Good. Don't tell him." "Not yet." I frowned. "Why not?" "He's my lawyer. He needs to know what evidence we have." "He needs to know eventually," Linda corrected. "But right now, we have a surprise weapon. If we reveal this too early, Susan's team will have time to prepare counter-arguments to challenge the document's validity, to spin the narrative. Better to keep it secret until the trial, then present it as a devastating surprise." It made sense. Everything Linda said always made sense. That's why I trusted her so completely. "What about the part about Edward being my biological father?" I asked. "Do we have to reveal that in court?" Linda's expression softened with sympathy. "Probably. The contract makes more sense if Edward had a personal connection to you beyond being your father's friend. His motivation for demanding the house go to you becomes clearer if you're his daughter. So the whole town will know my mother had an affair, that I'm illegitimate." The whole town will know your mother lied and your father David knew the truth and went along with the betrayal anyway. Mary, I know this is painful, but the truth is your most powerful weapon. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You've been fighting alone for so long. Let me help you carry this burden. So I did. I gave Linda copies of everything: the contract, the wire transfer, the confession letter. I kept the originals in a locked box in Ellen's guest room, but Linda had complete copies to review and prepare with. Over the next few weeks, she helped me craft a timeline, organize the evidence, prepare for how we'd present everything in court. The hearing was rescheduled for February, contingent on my father's health. He'd been transferred to a rehabilitation facility, still weak but recovering. My mother continued to refuse my visits, spreading the story that I'd caused his heart attack with my vindictive lawsuit. The court of public opinion remained firmly against me, but Linda kept saying it didn't matter. Let them think what they want now, she said. When we present this evidence in court, everything will change. The truth will come out and everyone will see who the real villains are. I believed her. I trusted her completely, which made what happened in early January even more devastating. It was a Tuesday night, nearly midnight. Ethan couldn't sleep. He'd been having nightmares since my father's collapse. Dreams about hospitals and sirens and families breaking apart. I was lying in bed reading when I heard his footsteps in the hallway heading to the kitchen for water. Then I heard voices. Low, urgent. One of them was Linda's. I got up quietly and crept to my doorway. Linda was in the living room, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a voice I'd never heard her use before, sharp, businesslike, nothing like the warm empathy she showed me. I have the contract copy, she was saying. The wire transfer receipt too, and the father's confession letter. Everything you asked for. My blood ran cold. When will you pay for my daughter's surgery? Linda continued. You promised $50,000 once I got you the evidence. She needs the operation next month, or they're saying she might not make it. A pause while she listened to whoever was on the other end. I understand you need time to verify the documents are real. But please, my daughter is 9 years old. She has a congenital heart defect, and the surgery is her only chance. You promised to help if I helped you. Another pause, then barely audible through my doorway, I heard the voice on the other end of the line. Female. Familiar. Susan. Don't worry, Linda. As soon as we confirm these documents are what you say they are, you'll get your money. Your daughter will have her surgery. You're doing the right thing. I stepped into the living room. Linda's back was to me and she didn't hear me approach. Thank you, Linda said into the phone. I know this is wrong, but I have to choose my child. I have to... What the hell is this? Linda spun around, her face going white. She dropped the phone. Mary, I can explain. You've been working for Susan this whole time. No, not the whole time. I met you genuinely. I wanted to help you genuinely. But then Susan found out I was advising you, and she did research on me, and she discovered my daughter's condition. She offered to pay for the surgery if I gave her copies of your evidence. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. You've been feeding information to the other side for months. Only for 6 weeks, since mid-November after you found Edward. Susan knew you'd discovered something important, but she didn't know what. She needed to know what weapons you had so she could prepare. She offered me $50,000, Mary. My daughter is dying. The surgery costs $48,000, and our insurance won't cover it. What was I supposed to do? Not betray me. My voice broke. I trusted you. I told you everything. You were supposed to be on my side. I am on your side. My daughter comes first. She has to come first. Tears streamed down Linda's face. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But if you had a choice between justice for yourself and saving Ethan's life, which would you choose? The question hit me like a slap, because I knew the answer. I'd choose Ethan, every time, without hesitation. That doesn't make this right, I whispered. I know, but it makes it understandable, doesn't it? Linda's voice was pleading. I didn't want to hurt you. I've been trying to help you as much as I can while still getting my daughter what she needs. But Susan has the copies now. She knows about Edward, the contract, everything, and I can't take it back. I thought about the locked box in my room, the original documents Edward had given me, the confession letter in my father's handwriting. Linda had copies, but I still had the originals. "Get out," I said quietly. "Get out of Ellen's house and never contact me again." "Mary, please. Your daughter needs surgery. Fine, I understand that. But you made your choice and I'm making mine. Get out." Linda gathered her things with shaking hands, still crying, still apologizing. At the door, she turned back one last time. "For what it's worth, I really did care about you. The friendship was real even if the loyalty wasn't. And I hope you win. I hope you destroy them all." Then she was gone. I stood in the living room trembling with betrayal and rage. Susan knew about Edward now. She knew about the contract, the wire transfer, the confession letter. She'd have time to prepare counter-arguments to discredit the evidence, to spin the story her way. I'd lost the element of surprise. I'd lost my friend. But I still had one copy left, the originals, in my locked box, and nobody knew about them. After Linda left, I sat in the dark living room for over an hour trying to decide what to do. Susan now had copies of my most powerful evidence. She'd have time to prepare, to create doubt, to attack the document's legitimacy. Harris still didn't know about any of it. I'd kept it secret per Linda's advice that now seemed designed to keep me isolated and vulnerable. At 2 a.m, I called Edward. "She betrayed me," I said when he answered, my voice hollow. "Linda was working for Susan the whole time. She gave them copies of everything." There was a long silence. Then Edward spoke, his voice steady and calm. "Come stay with me. You and Ethan. Pack your things and come here tonight." "Edward, I can't just—" "Ellen is dying, Mary. Her heart is failing faster than the doctors expected. She needs peace in her final weeks, not the stress of housing someone in the middle of a legal war. And you need family right now. Real family." His voice softened. "Please, let me be your father. Let me help you." So at 3 a.m, I packed our meager belongings into the car while Ethan rubbed sleep from his eyes. Ellen was awake, despite the late hour, sitting in her recliner with an oxygen mask. "Go," she said when I tried to apologize for leaving. "Edward's right. You need family, and I need to rest." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Win this fight, Mary. Win it for all of us who've been trampled by people who think they can get away with anything." We drove to Riverside in the dark, and Edward was waiting on his porch when we arrived, a light on in the kitchen and the smell of coffee already brewing. The next morning, sitting at his kitchen table while Ethan explored the garden outside, I told Edward about Linda's betrayal. "So Susan knows about the contract, the wire transfer, your confession letter, all of it," I finished. "She'll have time to prepare counter-arguments. Maybe claim the contract is fake, or that it was superseded by later agreements, or that it doesn't matter because—" "Mary." Edward held up his hand, stopping me. "I told you I had backup copies in a safe deposit box." "Yes, but Linda has copies too now. It doesn't matter how many copies we have if Susan knows what's coming." "You're not understanding me." Edward stood and walked to a closet, returning with a metal lockbox. "The copies I gave you weren't the backups. These are." He opened the box and pulled out a set of documents sealed in plastic. The contract, the wire transfer receipt, and the confession letter, all of them severely water damaged, the ink bleeding, some sections barely legible. "These are the originals from my safe deposit box," Edward explained. "They were damaged in the 2016 basement flood at the bank. I thought they were ruined, so I had them professionally restored by a forensic document lab. It took a month and cost me $3,000, but they extracted and reprinted every legible word." He pulled out another set of documents. "These are the forensically restored versions, complete with certification from the lab that they're accurate reproductions of the damaged originals. But the ones you gave me were my personal working copies that I'd made years ago for my own files. Still legitimate, still valid. But these—" he tapped the sealed documents. These are the ones with the full chain of custody documentation, forensic certification, and bank records proving they existed before 2016, before your lawsuit was ever filed. Susan can't claim you fabricated them recently because the bank has records of me storing them in 2015. I stared at the documents, understanding dawning. Susan doesn't know about these. No one does except me, and now you. Edward smiled. Linda gave Susan information that's accurate but incomplete. Susan thinks she knows what's coming. She doesn't. Over the next month, Edward became the father I'd never had. He made breakfast every morning, pancakes for Ethan, coffee, and toast for me. He helped Ethan with homework at the kitchen table, patient, in a way my father David never was. He listened when I needed to talk and sat in comfortable silence when I needed quiet. Ethan took to calling him Grandpa Ed within the first week. Is that okay? Edward asked me, his eyes uncertain. I don't want to presume. It's more than okay, I said, and meant it. In late February, Susan made her move. Marcus Webb sent a formal settlement offer through Harris, $100,000 in exchange for dropping the lawsuit and signing a non-disclosure agreement. The letter made it sound generous, almost magnanimous. Ms. Whitmore, in the spirit of family reconciliation and to spare her ailing father further stress, is willing to offer Ms. Williams a substantial sum to resolve this matter quietly and permanently. Harris called me immediately. This is a good offer, Mary. Better than what we might get at trial, especially given the negative publicity. What do you think I should do? He hesitated. Personally, take it. $100,000 is life-changing money. You could buy a small house, start fresh somewhere new. This lawsuit has destroyed your reputation in town. Even if we win, you'll never be welcome here again. Let me think about it, I said. I told Susan's lawyer I was considering the offer but needed time to discuss it with my son to make sure I was making the right choice for his future. I played the part of the exhausted single mother worn down by months of fighting, tempted by the promise of peace and money. Susan believed it. Over the next 2 weeks, she sent increasingly friendly emails through her lawyer, then directly to me. I know this has been hard on both of us. I want to move forward to heal as a family. The money is just a gesture of goodwill. Then she made her mistake. Ethan was doing homework on my laptop one evening when he called me over. Mom, Aunt Susan sent you another email. But there's something weird about it. I looked at the screen. It was a typical message from Susan talking about reconciliation and fresh starts. But Ethan was pointing at the email address in the to field. That's not your email. That's her lawyer's. But it got sent to you too, like she hit reply all by accident. He was right. The email was addressed to Marcus Webb with me accidentally copied, and the tone was completely different from the version I was supposed to see. Marcus, she's falling for it. The settlement offer has her exactly where we want her. Once she signs, the NDA will prevent her from ever talking about the forged signature or the contract. We can finally put this to bed. My mother was right, everyone has a price. Mary's is $100K. Below that was an earlier message from Susan to Webb dated 3 weeks prior. I know the contract Edward gave her seems legitimate, but so what? We can argue it was superseded by verbal agreements, or that Dad was mentally incompetent when he signed it, or that the whole thing is unenforceable. The important thing is keeping her from testifying about the forged signature. That's the only thing that could really hurt us. The settlement with NDA is the safest play. Mom, Ethan said quietly. How did we get this email? I don't know. It must have been a mistake when she replied. No, I mean, he looked uncomfortable. I was trying to look up something for my school project about family trees, and I wondered if Aunt Susan had any old family photos on her email, so I tried to log into her account. Ethan, you can't hack people's email. I didn't hack anything, I just tried her birthday as the password. People always use birthdays. It worked on the first try. He looked at me with those serious 11-year-old eyes. Is that bad? Did I do something wrong? I should have scolded him, should have lectured him about privacy and ethics. But instead, I looked at the incriminating emails on the screen, Susan admitting the forged signature was real, admitting the settlement was designed to silence me, admitting she knew about Edward's contract. "Forward these to my email," I said. "Then log out and never do that again." "So it was okay this one time?" "No. But what's done is done." I watched the emails arrive in my inbox, then had Ethan delete all traces of the login from my laptop's history. "And Ethan?" "We don't tell anyone how we got these. Not Harris, not Edward, not anyone." "Why not?" "Because sometimes the right evidence comes from the wrong place, and sometimes you have to protect the people you love by keeping secrets." The next day, I sent Susan's lawyer a response accepting the settlement offer and asking for the paperwork to be drawn up. I played my part perfectly, the defeated woman grateful for the chance to move on, willing to sign away her rights for money and peace. Susan thought she'd bought my silence. She didn't know I'd bought her confession. The trial began on March 4th, a gray Monday morning with rain threatening. I walked into the courthouse with Edward on one side and Ethan on the other, my small, borrowed family facing the one that had rejected me. The courtroom was packed. The case had attracted enough attention that people lined up for seats like it was a theater performance, instead of the destruction of my family. Judge Brennan looked older than she had 5 months ago when my father collapsed during the preliminary hearing. She surveyed the packed courtroom with obvious distaste. "This is not entertainment," she announced. "This is a court of law dealing with serious allegations of fraud. I will have order or I will clear this room. Are we understood?" Everyone nodded. Susan sat at the defendant's table with Marcus Webb wearing a modest blue dress and minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple style. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be, a wronged sister, confused and hurt by accusations she didn't understand. My mother sat directly behind her in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of dignified suffering. My father was absent, still too weak from the heart attack to attend, or so they claimed. I suspected he simply couldn't bear to watch. Webb delivered his opening statement first, and it was masterful. He painted Susan as the devoted daughter who'd taken care of aging parents while Mary pursued her own selfish interests. He described me as the absent family member who rarely visited, who worked constant double shifts, and left my son with neighbors instead of family. He made it sound like Susan had rescued Ethan and me from ourselves, only to be attacked with a baseless lawsuit when we wanted more than they could give. "The evidence will show that Mary Williams signed the deed transfer willingly," Webb said, his voice gentle and reasonable. "That she agreed her sister's family with 3 children needed the house more than she did. That this lawsuit is nothing but an attempt to extort money from a family that has always tried to help her." Then it was Harris's turn. He was brief and methodical, laying out the facts without emotion. The foreclosure, the $80,000 payment, the forged signature, the broken promises. "The evidence will prove that Mary Williams was defrauded by her own family," he said. "That her signature was forged, her money was taken, and her trust was betrayed. This is not a family dispute. This is fraud." The judge called the first witness. Dr. Patricia Chen returned to the stand, the same forensic document examiner who testified at the preliminary hearing. She walked the court through her analysis again, this time with enlarged photographs of my signature from dozens of documents compared to the signature on the deed transfer. "These signatures are not consistent," she testified. "The deed transfer signature shows characteristics of simulation, someone attempting to copy Ms. Williams's signature but lacking the natural flow and pressure patterns of her authentic writing." Webb cross-examined her aggressively, suggesting that stress could alter handwriting that I might have signed quickly without thinking. But Dr. Chen held firm. "I've examined hundreds of signatures written under stress, Mr. Webb. This isn't stress variation. This is forgery." Then Harris called Edward to the stand. The courtroom buzzed when Edward entered, a tall, distinguished man in his 70s, walking with a slight limp, but carrying himself with dignity. Susan's face went white. My mother's hands gripped the railing in front of her. Edward took the oath and sat down, his clear blue eyes fixed on the judge. "Please state your name and your relationship to the parties in this case," Harris said. "Edward Morrison. I've known the Williams family for over 50 years. I was David Williams's best friend from childhood." He paused, then added quietly, "And I'm Mary's biological father." The courtroom erupted. Judge Brennan banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order, I will have order, or I will clear this courtroom." When the noise died down, Harris continued. "Mr. Morrison, did you provide financial assistance to the Williams family in 2015? "I did. David called me when the house was being foreclosed on. I agreed to pay the full amount, $80,000, but only under specific conditions." Harris presented the contract, the one with full forensic documentation proving it had existed since 2015. Edward walked the court through every detail: how he'd insisted the house go to Mary, how David had signed the agreement, how Ruth had found and destroyed the original contract. "I kept a backup in my safe deposit box," Edward testified. "When the bank's basement flooded in 2016, the documents were damaged. I had them professionally restored by a forensic document laboratory. What you're seeing is the certified restoration of that original contract." Webb's cross-examination tried to poke holes in the timeline and Edward's motivations in the legitimacy of a water-damaged document. But Edward remained calm, answering every question with the steady certainty of someone telling the truth. Then Harris played his trump card, my father's confession letter written 1 week before his heart attack. The courtroom went silent as Harris read David Williams's words aloud. The admission that he'd agreed to give me the house. The confession that Ruth had destroyed the contract. The acknowledgement that I'd been betrayed by the people who should have protected me. I watched Susan as the letter was read. Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't tell if they were genuine or performed. She'd always been good at crying on command. When Harris finished, Judge Brennan called a 15-minute recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, people whispering, phones immediately coming out to text updates to friends who hadn't gotten seats. Edward squeezed my hand. "You're doing great." "We haven't gotten to the best part yet," I whispered back. When court resumed, Harris called me to the stand. I walked up with shaking legs, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Then I told my story, all of it. The scholarship Susan stole, the fiancé she took, the house I paid for, the locks being changed while my son stood in the rain. Webb's cross-examination was brutal. He asked about my relationship with Ethan's father, implying I was unstable in relationships. He questioned my work schedule, suggesting I was neglectful. He painted me as bitter, jealous, and vindictive. "Isn't it true, Ms. Williams, that you've always been envious of your sister's stable marriage and larger family?" "No." "Isn't it true that you rarely visited your parents because you couldn't bear to see your sister's success?" "I rarely visited because my mother made it clear I wasn't welcome." "Or because you were plotting this lawsuit, waiting for the right moment to strike?" "I was surviving. That's all I've ever done." When Webb finished, Harris stood for redirect. "Ms. Williams, do you have any additional evidence you'd like to present to this court?" "I do." I pulled out the printed emails, Susan's accidental confession to her lawyer. Harris entered them as evidence, and I watched Susan's face as he read them aloud. "Marcus, she's falling for it. The settlement offer has her exactly where we want her. My mother was right. Everyone has a price." And then the devastating second email. "I know the contract Edward gave her seems legitimate, but so what? We can argue it was superseded by verbal agreements, or that Dad was mentally incompetent when he signed it. The important thing is keeping her from testifying about the forged signature. That's the only thing that could really hurt us." Susan's lawyer shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I object. These emails were obtained illegally. This is a violation of attorney-client privilege." "Thumbs?" "Your Honor," Harris countered, "these emails were sent to my client directly. Ms. Whitmore accidentally copied Ms. Williams on communications she intended to keep private. That's not illegal acquisition. That's Ms. Whitmore's own mistake." Judge Brennan reviewed the email headers carefully. The emails show Ms. Williams as a recipient accidentally copied by Ms. Whitmore's reply all error. There's no evidence of hacking or illegal access. The emails are admissible. Susan collapsed forward, her head in her hands. My mother tried to stand, tried to leave the courtroom, but Judge Brennan's voice cut through the chaos. Mrs. Williams, sit down. You're not dismissed. My mother sat, her face carved from stone. The judge banged the gavel. This court will recess until April 5th, at which time I will deliver my verdict. Until then, all parties are ordered to have no contact with each other. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted again, but I barely heard it. It was done. All the evidence was out there. The forgery, the contract, the confession, Susan's own admission that she knew it was fraud. But the verdict wouldn't come for another month. And in that month, everything would fall apart. The month waiting for the verdict felt like drowning in slow motion. I'd presented every piece of evidence, exposed Susan's confession, proven the forgery beyond doubt. But Judge Brennan had seemed troubled during the final day of testimony, asking pointed questions about chain of custody and document authentication that made me nervous. Harris assured me it was routine. Judges always scrutinize evidence carefully in fraud cases. Don't worry. We presented a bulletproof case. But something felt wrong. Harris had been distracted throughout the trial, arriving late to court sessions, forgetting to call witnesses in the order we'd planned, seeming almost relieved when things went poorly. I'd attributed it to stress, to the complexity of the case, to his age showing through under pressure. Edward was less charitable. There's something off about him, he said one evening as we sat in his living room. The way he looked at me when I testified, it wasn't surprise or professional interest. It was hatred. You barely know him. I know men, and I know what 40-year-old grudges look like. It was Ethan who first noticed Harris meeting with Susan. He'd started walking to the library after school, a 3-block trip from Edward's house, and one afternoon he came home agitated. Mom, I saw Mr. Harris today. He was at the coffee shop near the library with Aunt Susan. That's impossible. The judge ordered no contact between... I know what I saw. They were sitting at a back table and she was crying and he was holding her hand. I took a picture. He pulled out his phone and showed me. The image was grainy, shot through the coffee shop window, but unmistakable. Harris and Susan sitting close, her hand in his, their heads bent together in intimate conversation. When was this? About an hour ago. Should I have said something to them? No, you did exactly right. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. Ethan, if you see them together again, take more pictures. But don't let them see you. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan photographed Harris and Susan meeting 3 more times. Always at the same coffee shop, always in the back corner, always looking like old friends rather than opposing lawyers. I showed the photos to Edward. His face went dark. I'm hiring a private investigator, he said. Someone who can dig into Harris's finances, his background, his connections. If he's been working with Susan this whole time, that would mean he sabotaged my case from the beginning, that he took it pro bono so he could control it from the inside. Yes, it would mean exactly that. The investigator Edward hired was a woman named Patricia Reeves, a former FBI agent who now ran a small firm specializing in financial fraud. She was efficient, thorough, and expensive, but Edward paid her fees without hesitation. 2 weeks later, she delivered her report in Edward's living room, her expression grim. Mr. Harris has received 3 payments of $10,000 each from Susan Whitmore's account over the past 6 months, she began. The payments were disguised as legal consulting fees and routed through a shell company, but I traced them back to her personal checking account. $30,000. My lawyer had been paid $30,000 by the opposing party. That's illegal, I whispered. That's conflict of interest fraud and probably grounds for disbarment, Patricia agreed. But it gets worse. She pulled out another document. In 2015, shortly before your family's foreclosure, Mr. Harris hired a professional document forger named Thomas Brennan, no relation to the judge. Brennan is known in certain circles for his ability to replicate signatures. He was paid $5,000 by Harris payment traced through Harris's personal account. The room tilted. Harris hired someone to forge my signature. That's my conclusion based on the financial evidence and timeline. The payment to Brennan occurred 2 weeks before the deed transfer was filed. But why? What would Harris gain from forging my signature? Patricia looked at Edward. That's where the story gets personal, Mr. Morrison. I researched Harris's background, his connection to your family. 40 years ago, Harris and Edward Morrison were both in love with Ruth Williams, then Ruth Parker. They competed for her affection. Edward's face went pale. I never knew Gerald felt that way about Ruth. We were friends. He never told you because he knew he'd lose. Ruth chose you, or so she thought. When her father forced her to marry David Williams instead, Harris blamed you for setting the whole thing in motion. That's insane. I didn't make Ruth's father arrange that marriage. Rational or not, Harris has held that grudge for 40 years. Patricia pulled out more documents. It gets worse. I investigated Harris's legal practice and found a pattern. Over the past 20 years, he's represented at least 5 other clients in property disputes, where signatures were later questioned. In 3 of those cases, forensic analysis suggested forgery, but the cases were settled before criminal charges could be filed. He's done this before. I said, my voice hollow. He's been forging signatures and then representing the victims, controlling their cases to make sure the truth never comes out. That's my assessment. And there's one more thing. Patricia hesitated. Your neighbor Ellen Carter. She died 4 months ago, correct? Yes, heart failure. She'd been sick for a while. The death was ruled natural causes, but I spoke with her cardiologist. He was surprised by how quickly she declined. She'd been stable for months, then suddenly deteriorated in the week before the trial. He ordered an autopsy review, but the family, specifically your mother, refused to authorize it. The room went cold. You think someone killed Ellen? Edward asked. I think Ellen had evidence that would have destroyed Ruth and Susan's case. I think she was going to testify about the recording she made. And I think her death was suspiciously convenient. Patricia closed her folder. I can't prove murder, but I can prove that Harris knew Ellen was going to testify and that he had multiple meetings with Ruth Williams in the weeks before Ellen died. I couldn't breathe. Ellen, who'd taken us in, who'd promised to tell the truth in court, who'd kept that recording for 2 years waiting for the right moment to use it dead just before she could testify. I drove to Harris's office that afternoon without calling ahead. His secretary tried to stop me, but I pushed past her into his book-lined office where this whole nightmare had started 18 months ago. Harris looked up from his desk, unsurprised to see me. Mary, I thought you might come. You forged my signature. My voice shook with rage. You hired someone to forge it, then you took my case so you could sabotage it from the inside. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those same sympathetic eyes that had fooled me completely. 40 years ago, Edward Morrison stole the love of my life. Oh, he didn't know it. Ruth never told him how I felt. But I watched her choose him, watched her get pregnant with his child with you, and I had to smile and pretend to be happy for them all. He smiled, but it was cold and bitter. When your father came to me in 2015, desperate and broke, I saw my chance. Ruth wanted to keep you from getting the house. I helped her forge your signature. And when you filed suit, I made sure I was your lawyer so I could control exactly how much of the truth came out. You destroyed my life for revenge against Edward. I destroyed your life because you were never supposed to exist. You were the proof of Ruth's betrayal, the constant reminder that she chose Edward over me. He stood up. But I didn't kill Ellen. I'm many things, Mary, but I'm not a murderer. Then who did? He walked to the window, looking out at the street below. Ellen's death was suspicious. The timing, the sudden decline. I didn't kill her, but I know who did. Who? He turned back to me, and for just a moment something like pity crossed his face. And then he said the name that would destroy everything I thought I knew. Your mother. I left Harris's office and drove straight to the police station. Detective Sarah Chen listened to my story with growing concern, the forged signature, the $30,000 payments, Harris's confession that my mother had killed Ellen. She made calls, requested warrants, set machinery in motion that couldn't be stopped. 2 days later, I stood outside my mother's house, the house that should have been mine, and watched police cars pull up with their lights off. Detective Chen had asked me to be there, though I didn't understand why until later. My mother opened the door before they could knock. She stood in the doorway wearing a cardigan and slippers, her gray hair perfectly combed, looking like everyone's grandmother. When she saw the detectives, she didn't look surprised. She looked almost relieved. "I've been waiting for this day," she said quietly, stepping aside to let them enter. They arrested her in the living room while I watched from the doorway. Read her rights. Handcuffed her with gentle efficiency. But before they could lead her out, she looked directly at me. "I need to tell her the truth," she said to Detective Chen. "Before you take me away, she deserves to know why. You have the right to remain silent, Mrs. Williams. I waive that right. I want to confess. All of it." My mother's voice was steady, almost peaceful. "But I need to tell my daughter first." Detective Chen looked at me. I nodded, unable to speak. They let my mother sit on the couch, still handcuffed. I sat across from her in the chair where I'd sat 1,000 times as a child. Detective Chen stayed in the room, another officer by the door. "Ellen Carter died in August," my mother began. 4 months ago. Heart failure, the doctors said. But it wasn't heart failure. I poisoned her." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. "I used her own blood pressure medication, Digitalis. Too much of it mimics a heart attack. I knew because I'd been a nurse before I married your father. I visited Ellen every day that last week, brought her tea, made sure she took her medicine, and then took extra pills that I crushed into her afternoon coffee." My mother's voice didn't waver. "She died peacefully. She never knew." "Why?" The word came out as a whisper. "Because Ellen knew the secret. She was the only one left alive who knew, and she was going to testify in court and tell everyone." My mother finally looked at me. Really looked at me. "Ellen was the midwife when you were born, Mary. She was there the day you came into this world. And she knew immediately she could count back the months and do the math that you weren't David's child." My hands gripped the armrests of the chair. "You told Edward. In court. You said—" "I said Edward was your biological father. That's true. But I didn't tell the whole truth. I didn't tell anyone that I was already pregnant when I married David. 3 months pregnant with Edward's baby." The room seemed to shrink around me. "How?" "I was 19. Edward and I were in love, real love, the kind you read about in books. We'd been together secretly for a year. My father would have killed us both if he'd known. Edward was poor, his family had nothing. My father wanted me to marry David Williams, whose father owned half the town. Money, status, security." Her voice turned bitter. "My father sold me like cattle, and I was too afraid to say no. But I was already carrying Edward's child." "Did Edward know?" "No. He'd enlisted in the military 2 months before, trying to make something of himself so he could come back and ask my father for my hand properly." "He didn't know I was pregnant? He didn't know my father had already arranged my marriage? He left and I married David a month later." "And David knew. He knew I wasn't his—" "He suspected from the beginning. You were born 7 months after the wedding, early, I told everyone. But David wasn't stupid. And when you grew up looking nothing like him, looking exactly like Edward, he knew for certain." My mother's hands twisted in the handcuffs. "But he never said anything. He raised you as his own. He tried to love you, but every time he looked at you, he saw my betrayal. So Edward never knew he had a daughter. Never. He came back from the military 2 years later, married someone else, moved away. I saw him occasionally over the years. He and David had stayed friends somehow, but Edward never knew you were his, and I made sure it stayed that way." Why Why couldn't you tell him? Because if Edward knew, everything would fall apart. My marriage, my reputation, my control over my own life. Her voice rose slightly. I'd been forced into a marriage I didn't want, forced to give up the man I loved, forced to live a lie for 40 years. The one thing I could control was the secret, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. So when Edward gave Dad $80,000 to save the house, he was saving his own daughter's home without even knowing it. Yes. And when Ellen threatened to testify and tell the court the whole truth, not just about the forged signature, but about everything I had to stop her. My mother looked at me with something that might have been love or might have been madness. I couldn't let Edward find out. I couldn't let the whole town know. I'd rather go to prison than have everyone know I'd been lying for 40 years. Detective Chen stepped forward. Mrs. Williams, we need to take you to the station now. My mother stood dignified even in handcuffs. As they led her past me, she stopped. I'm sorry, Mary, for all of it, but not for keeping the secret. That secret was the only thing that was ever truly mine. They took her away, and I sat alone in that living room staring at walls that had witnessed 4 decades of lies. My whole life was a lie. My father wasn't my father. My mother was a murderer. And the man I'd been searching for was the only real family I ever had. Edward insisted on the DNA test, even though we both already knew the truth. For legal purposes, he said, and for closure. We went to a clinic together, had our cheeks swabbed, and waited 3 weeks for results that would confirm what my mother had already confessed. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Edward opened it with shaking hands, read the results, and looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. 99.9% probability of paternity, he whispered. Mary, you're my daughter. You're really my daughter. He pulled me into his arms, and I felt something break open inside my chest. 40 years of not belonging, of wondering why I was never good enough, all of it dissolving in the embrace of a man who'd searched for me without even knowing I existed. I should have known. You're so much like me. Your stubbornness, your sense of justice, even the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. I should have seen it. How could you? No one told you. I should have known anyway. He held me at arm's length, studying my face like he was memorizing it. I wasted 40 years not knowing I had a daughter. I won't waste another day. The truth shattered what remained of my family. Susan came to Edward's house 3 days after our mother's arrest, her face blotchy from crying, her usual perfection completely gone. She stood on the porch, looking small and broken. Can I come in? She asked. I need to talk to you. We sat in Edward's living room, the space between us heavy with decades of resentment and betrayal. Susan twisted her hands in her lap, unable to meet my eyes. I knew Mom forged your signature, she said finally. I knew the house should have been yours. I told myself it didn't matter because I needed it more, because my family was bigger, because you'd always been stronger than me. Her voice cracked. But I didn't know she killed Ellen. I swear to you, Mary, I didn't know Mom went that far. I was jealous my whole life, but I never wanted this. I never wanted anyone to die. You took the house anyway. You knew it was fraud, and you took it. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She finally looked at me, and I saw genuine horror in her eyes. Our mother is a murderer. She killed a 72-year-old woman to protect a lie. How do I live with that? How do I tell my children their grandmother poisoned someone? I had no answer for her. I was still trying to figure out how to live with it myself. David. I couldn't think of him as my father anymore, was in psychiatric care at County Medical. The revelation that he'd raised another man's child for 40 years, that his entire marriage had been built on lies, had broken something fundamental in him. He sat in his hospital bed, staring at walls, barely speaking, barely eating. The doctors said it might be months before he could process the trauma enough to function again. That evening, I told Ethan everything. He listened quietly, his 11-year-old face serious and thoughtful. "So Grandpa Ed is really my grandpa?" he asked when I finished. "Like, actually related to us by blood?" "Yes, he's your biological grandfather." Ethan thought about this for a moment, then smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks. "Good," he said simply. "He's the best grandpa ever anyway." Out of the mouths of children comes the clearest truth. Edward was the best grandfather Ethan could have asked for, and it turned out he'd been the real one all along. The trial was postponed indefinitely. Judge Brennan ruled that with Ruth facing murder charges and Harris facing fraud and conspiracy charges, the property case couldn't proceed until the criminal matters were resolved. My lawsuit was frozen in legal limbo, everything on hold, while the justice system processed the wreckage of my family. Harris was arrested and disbarred within a week. The evidence Patricia Reeves had gathered, combined with his own partial confession to me, was enough to charge him with conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. He'd spend years in prison, his 40-year revenge plot finally exposed. And I had to decide, do I still want the house, knowing it cost a woman's life? The sentences came down in July, delivered in 3 separate courtrooms over the span of 1 week. I attended every hearing sitting in the gallery with Edward beside me, watching justice play out in increments of years and dollars. Ruth was sentenced first. The prosecutor had charged her with first-degree murder, but her lawyer negotiated it down to voluntary manslaughter, a mercy I wasn't sure she deserved. The judge gave her 12 years in state prison, citing her age and lack of prior criminal history as mitigating factors. My mother stood when the sentence was read, her back straight, her face expressionless. She didn't look at me as the bailiff led her away. Harris received 10 years for fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He'd helped forge my signature, sabotaged my case from within, and taken $30,000 from Susan to ensure I'd lose. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he simply shook his head. The man who'd spent 40 years plotting revenge looked tired and empty, like the hate had finally burned him hollow. Susan faced no criminal charges. She hadn't forged the signature herself, hadn't poisoned Ellen, hadn't technically broken any laws beyond accepting stolen property. But Judge Brennan wasn't finished with her. In the civil hearing that followed, the judge ordered Susan to pay me $120,000 in compensation, the $80,000 I'd paid to save the house, plus $40,000 in damages for fraud, emotional distress, and the year and a half I'd spent homeless or displaced. "And as for the property at 247 Maple Street," Judge Brennan said, looking directly at me over her reading glasses, "the deed transfer obtained through forgery is hereby declared null and void. The house is awarded to Mary Williams, the rightful owner. Ms. Whitmore, you have 30 days to vacate the premises." She paused and her voice softened slightly. "Ms. Williams' fraud cannot stand in a court of law. You've proven your case beyond any doubt, but I hope you find peace in that house, not just property. Justice isn't always the same as healing." I should have felt triumphant. I'd won everything. The house, the money, the vindication I'd been seeking for 2 years. But sitting in that courtroom, listening to the judge's words, I felt nothing but emptiness. Edward drove me home to his home, not the house I'd just won, in silence. When we pulled into his driveway, he turned to me with concern etched in every line of his face. "You have the house," he said quietly. "But are you happy?" I couldn't answer him. Over the next month, I watched Susan's life disintegrate from a distance. She sold her car to raise money for the compensation. Her jewelry, her designer clothes, everything of value went to pay the debt she owed me. The town that had once supported her now whispered behind her back. Her mother was a murderer, her family built on fraud and lies. Her children came home from school crying because classmates called their grandmother a killer. Her husband, who'd stood by her through the lawsuit, grew distant and cold, their marriage cracking under the weight of shame and financial strain. I should have felt vindicated by her suffering. Instead, I just felt tired. Susan came to Edward's house on the 28th day, 2 days before she had to vacate. She looked like she'd aged a decade in a month, thinner, paler, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. "The house is ready for you," she said, standing on the porch with an envelope in her hands. "I've cleaned everything, packed all our belongings. The keys are inside." She held out the envelope. "And here's the first payment toward the 120,000. It's all I could gather, 35,000. I'll pay the rest in installments over the next 2 years if that's acceptable." I took the envelope but didn't open it. "I know you hate me," Susan continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I deserve it. I took what wasn't mine. I helped Mom commit fraud. I destroyed your life because I was jealous and selfish and weak." She looked up at me and I saw genuine desperation in her eyes. "But Mary Mom is 63 years old. 12 years means she'll be 75 when she gets out if she survives that long. Prison is killing her. She's lost 30 pounds already. The guards say she barely eats, barely speaks. She's just waiting to die." "What do you want me to do about it?" Susan's voice broke. "I want to know if you'd consider asking for a reduced sentence, appealing for mercy. You're the victim, your voice matters more than anyone's. If you asked the parole board to show leniency, they might listen." I stared at my sister. This woman who'd tormented me my entire life, who'd taken my scholarship and my fiancé and my house, who was now begging me to show mercy to the mother who'd murdered to protect her lies. I'd won, but victory tasted like ashes. And then Susan said something that changed everything. "Do you want Mom to die in prison?" I visited my mother 3 weeks later at the State Correctional Facility, a gray concrete building 2 hours north that looked exactly like what it was, a place where hope went to die. The guard led me through metal detectors and locked doors that clanged shut behind us with terrible finality, each sound a reminder that my mother would hear those doors for the next 12 years. They brought her to a visiting room divided by thick plexiglass. The woman who sat down across from me looked nothing like the composed, controlling mother I'd known my entire life. She'd lost at least 30 pounds, her face gaunt and pale, her gray hair thin and unwashed. Prison had aged her 10 years and 6 months. We picked up our phones simultaneously. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Do you hate me?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible through the speaker. I'd come prepared to confront her with my anger, to make her feel the weight of everything she'd done. But looking at this broken woman who'd once terrified me, I found myself asking a different question entirely. "Did you ever love me, even a little?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I loved you wrong. I looked at you every day and Edward saw my own mistake, saw everything I'd lost when my father forced me to marry David. I tried to control you instead of trust you. I pushed you down so Susan could rise, thinking that would somehow make my sacrificed life mean something." She pressed her hand against the plexiglass. "Don't let hate destroy you like it destroyed me, Mary. I spent 40 years letting bitterness and fear control every decision. I murdered a kind woman to protect a lie. That's what hate does, it makes you into someone you never thought you could become." I left the prison with her words echoing in my head, and drove straight to the law office of Margaret Chen, an attorney specializing in sentence appeals. I hired her that same day. "I want to petition for a reduced sentence for Ruth Williams," I told her. "Not because she deserves mercy, but because I don't want my mother to die in prison. She needs to pay for what she did, but 12 years is a death sentence for a woman her age." Margaret filed the appeal within a week. The hearing took 2 months to schedule, but when it came, I stood before the parole board and spoke on behalf of the woman who'd poisoned Ellen Carter to silence her. "My mother committed a terrible crime," I said. "She took a life to protect a lie, but I'm asking you to reduce her sentence from 12 years to 7 years in prison, followed by 5 years of house arrest. She should pay for her crime, but she shouldn't die for it." The board approved the reduction in November. Ruth would serve 7 years behind bars, then 5 years confined to whatever home would take her. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was mercy. Susan sold everything over the next 6 months to pay me the full compensation. Her car, her jewelry, furniture, everything of value. She moved her family into a small rental house and took a job at the grocery store to make ends meet. The payments came in installments, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, each one accompanied by a brief note of apology. It was Ethan who suggested what to do with the money. We were sitting at Edward's kitchen table, the stack of checks spread out before us, when he spoke up. "Mom, what if we used it to help other people like us? Other moms and kids who don't have a place to live." Within a month, I'd established the Safe Homes for Single Mothers Fund. The $120,000 became seed money for a program that provided temporary housing job training and legal assistance to women fleeing abuse or facing homelessness. The house on Maple Street. The house that had cost so much pain became the first safe haven shelter, with 3 bedrooms for families in crisis. Susan showed up on opening day, asking if she could volunteer. I almost said no. Almost told her she'd done enough damage and needed to stay away. But I saw something different in her face now. Humility, genuine remorse, a desperate need to make amends. "I can't give you back the years I stole," she said. "But I can help you give other women what we both needed, a second chance." She volunteered every Saturday, cooking meals for the residents, watching their children while they attended job interviews, slowly learning how to be a sister instead of a rival. Our relationship didn't heal overnight, wounds that deep don't close quickly, but we began to build something new on the ruins of what had been destroyed. I thought justice meant punishment. But real justice is giving people a chance to be better. I moved into the house on a cold November morning, exactly 2 years after the day my mother locked me out in the rain. But I didn't move in alone. 3 single mothers and their children came with me. Women I'd met through the shelter network, women who'd been sleeping in cars or crowded into relatives' spare rooms. Women who needed exactly what I'd needed 2 years ago, a safe place to land while they rebuilt their lives. We gutted the house together over 3 weeks. The pink princess room that had been Ethan's became a shared bedroom for 2 young girls. My old bedroom became an office where residents could search for jobs and fill out applications. The dining room where Susan had served that manipulative dinner became a communal space with a large table where we ate meals together, shared struggles, and celebrated small victories like job interviews and accepted apartment applications. Edward moved in a week after we opened, claiming the small downstairs bedroom that had once been my father's study. "Someone needs to keep an eye on this place," he said, but we both knew the truth. He'd spent 40 years not knowing he had a daughter, and he wasn't going to waste another moment living apart from his family. He threw himself into repairs with the energy of a man half his age, fixing leaky faucets and squeaky doors, building shelves and repainting walls. On Saturday mornings, he taught Ethan woodworking in the garage. The 2 of them bent over projects with the same serious concentration, the same careful precision. The surprise came when David showed up one afternoon with a toolbox and a tentative expression. He'd been released from psychiatric care the month before, fragile but functional, living in a small apartment across town. He stood on the porch, looking uncertain, like he wasn't sure he had the right to be there. "I'd like to help," he said simply. "With the renovations, if you'll let me." I almost said no. This man had raised me knowing I wasn't his daughter, had treated me as less than Susan my entire childhood, had stood by while my mother betrayed me again and again. But I saw something different in his face now, not the weak, guilty man who'd let Ruth control his life, but someone trying desperately to make amends for 40 years of cowardice. "We're rebuilding the back deck," I said. "Could use an extra pair of hands." He worked alongside Edward for weeks, the 2 men who'd both loved Ruth, finding a strange peace in physical labor and shared purpose. They didn't talk much, but I'd catch them exchanging glances occasionally, acknowledgments of pain, of loss, of the complicated mess we'd all survived. The town's reaction to Safe Haven was hostile at first. The scandal of Ruth's murder conviction and the revelation of my parentage had made us pariahs. Neighbors complained about increased traffic, worried about property values, muttered about those women who needed charity. But attitudes shifted as months passed and people saw what we were actually doing, helping women get back on their feet, keeping children off the streets, giving second chances to people who'd made mistakes or simply had bad luck. The church that had once judged me so harshly donated furniture. The grocery store where Susan worked provided discounted food. local businesses began offering job interviews to our residents. Slowly, grudgingly, the community accepted that the House of Lies had become a house of healing. We unveiled the sign on a sunny Saturday in late November. Edward had carved it himself from oak wood, the letters burned deep and permanent. The gathered residents, volunteers, and a handful of supportive neighbors watched as we hung it above the front door. Ruth's house, a safe haven for second chances. Below, in smaller letters, in memory of Ellen Carter, who believed everyone deserves a home. I named it after my mother, not to honor her, but to transform what she'd broken into something that could heal. Her lies had built this house. Her murder had nearly destroyed it. But now her name would be attached to something redemptive, a place where women like me could find safety when their families failed them. That evening, after the residents had gone to bed and Edward and Ethan were watching a movie in the living room, I stood in the kitchen where my mother had once told me I didn't live there anymore. The house smelled like fresh paint and Ellen's cinnamon rolls, a recipe one of the residents had found and made for everyone. Through the window, I could see the garden Edward had planted, the deck David had helped rebuild, the swing set we'd installed for the children. For the first time in my life, the house felt like home. But there was one more thing I needed to do: visit Mom one last time. The letters started arriving in late September, one every week, written on prison stationery in my mother's careful handwriting. The first one I almost threw away unopened. The second I read with my jaw clenched and anger burning in my chest. But by the third, something had shifted in her words. A rawness, a honesty I'd never heard from her before. She wrote about her childhood, about her father's cruelty and her mother's silence. She wrote about falling in love with Edward when she was 18, about stolen moments and secret promises. She wrote about the terror of discovering she was pregnant and knowing her father would never allow her to marry a poor man. She wrote about 40 years of living a lie and how that lie had poisoned everything it touched. And in every letter she apologized, not with excuses or justifications, but with simple, devastating honesty about the pain she'd caused. The prison chaplain called me in November. "Your mother has been attending therapy and group counseling," she said. "She's helping other inmates work through their guilt and trauma. She's become a mentor to younger women. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've learned to recognize genuine transformation. Your mother is changing." It was that phone call that made me realize what needed to happen. I called Edward that evening and asked him a question I'd been afraid to ask. "Do you want to see her? After all these years, do you want to see Ruth?" His silence lasted so long I thought he'd hung up. Then quietly, "Yes. God help me, but yes." I arranged a special visitation for early December, pulling strings and calling in favors until the prison approved a private meeting room instead of the usual plexiglass barrier. Edward was silent on the 2-hour drive, his hands folded in his lap, his face unreadable. They brought my mother into the small room, and I watched two people who'd loved each other 40 years ago see each other for the first time since their world fell apart. Edward stood slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. My mother stopped in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. "Edward," she whispered. "Ruth." They stood there for a long moment, and then Edward crossed the room and took her hands in his. I saw tears streaming down both their faces. "I have something I need to give you," my mother said, her voice shaking. She pulled a folded yellowed envelope from her prison uniform pocket. "I wrote this 41 years ago. I never sent it. I was too afraid. But you deserve to know what I wanted to say." Edward opened it with trembling fingers. I watched him read the letter I'd never known existed, watched his face crumble as he absorbed words written before I was born. "I'm pregnant with your child," he read aloud, his voice breaking. "My father is forcing me to marry David Williams next month. I love you. I will always love you. But I'm too afraid to fight him. Forgive me. Ruth." "If I'd gotten this letter," Edward whispered, looking up at her. "If I'd known." "We would have raised Mary together," my mother finished. "We would have been happy. We would have had the life we were supposed to have. Edward pulled her into his arms and they stood there holding each other, while 40 years of grief and loss, and what might have been, filled the small room. I turned away, giving them privacy for a moment that belonged only to them. When they finally separated, Edward kept hold of her hands. "When you're released," he said firmly, "we'll start over. We've lost 40 years, Ruth. I won't lose whatever time we have left." "I'll be 70 when I get out," she said. "An old woman who murdered someone to protect a lie. Why would you want—" "Because I never stopped loving you. Not in 40 years. Not ever." My mother looked at me, then her eyes asking permission she didn't deserve but needed anyway. I thought about Ellen, about the murder that could never be undone. I thought about forgiveness and second chances and the difference between justice and vengeance. "Safe Haven will have a room for you," I heard myself say, "when you finish your house arrest, if you want it." She nodded, unable to speak. I left them there, two people who'd been separated by fear and control and lies, finally allowed to hold hands and plan a future that would begin 5 years from now. My mother would serve 5 more years in prison, learning to be someone better than the woman who'd let hate consume her. She'd help other inmates find their way. She'd write letters and go to therapy and slowly become the person she might have been if her father hadn't crushed her spirit before she'd learned to fight back. Mom would serve 5 more years. But she'd serve them with hope. And when she got out, she'd finally come home. 5 years passed like pages turning in a book I couldn't put down. The scared 10-year-old boy who'd stood in the rain became a 15-year-old young man with his grandfather's clear blue eyes and his mother's stubborn sense of justice. Ethan was an honors student now, pulling straight A's while working part-time at the hardware store and somehow still finding time to run the club he'd founded his freshman year. The Second Chances Club started small, just Ethan and 3 other kids meeting in an empty classroom after school. But by his sophomore year, it had grown to 25 members, all of them dedicated to helping students who'd been bullied, who came from broken homes, who needed someone to see them as more than their worst moments. They tutored struggling students, organized donation drives for families in crisis, and created a peer counseling program that the school district was now considering implementing across all their high schools. I sat in the audience at Lincoln High School's October Assembly, Edward beside me watching my son walk onto the stage to address 500 students and faculty. The principal had asked him to speak about the Second Chances Club and why he'd started it. I knew the real story, but I'd never heard Ethan tell it publicly before. He stood at the podium looking calm and confident, so different from the frightened child he'd been 7 years ago. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the auditorium. 7 years ago, I came home from school and stood in the rain for 3 hours because my key didn't work anymore. My grandmother had changed the locks and decided my mom and I didn't deserve to live in our own home. We slept in a car for weeks. People called my mom a liar and said terrible things about our family. I was 10 years old and I thought my whole world was ending. The auditorium was completely silent. But my mom lost everything and didn't lose herself. She could have chosen revenge. She could have destroyed the people who hurt us. Instead, she chose forgiveness over bitterness and justice over vengeance. She fought for what was right, but when she won, she didn't keep the victory for herself. She turned our home into a place that helps other moms who are going through what we went through. In the past 5 years, Safe Haven has helped 127 single mothers and their children find stability, find jobs, find hope. I felt Edward squeeze my hand. I started the Second Chances Club because I know what it's like to need one. My family needed a second chance. The moms living in our house need second chances. Even the people who hurt us, my grandmother, my aunt, the lawyer who betrayed us, they needed second chances to become better people. And most of them took it. That's what this club is about, believing that people can change, that mistakes don't define us forever, and that everyone deserves someone in their corner saying, "You can do better." The applause started slowly, then built until the entire auditorium was standing. I watched my son, this remarkable young man who'd learned compassion from suffering and strength from injustice, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pure, uncomplicated pride. Susan was waiting outside the auditorium when we emerged wearing her Safe Haven volunteer shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She'd been volunteering full-time for 3 years now, ever since she'd paid off the last of the compensation she owed me. She managed the intake process coordinated with social services and ran the job training workshops that had become Safe Haven's most successful program. "He's an amazing kid," she said, hugging me carefully. "Our relationship would never be what sisters should have been, but we'd built something real on the ruins of what was broken." "You raised him right." "We're raising him right," I corrected. "All of us together." David had died 2 years ago peacefully in his sleep at 73. The guilt and trauma of learning his entire life had been built on lies had never fully left him, but he'd spent his final years trying to make amends. He'd worked on Safe Haven renovations until his health failed, taught Ethan how to fix cars, and wrote me a letter before he died that I still kept in my dresser drawer. "I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved," it read, "but I'm grateful I got to watch you become the woman you were meant to be." He'd left his estate split equally between Susan and me, not a fortune, but enough to expand Safe Haven to a second location. The new house opened last month, providing space for 5 more families. The recognition came in waves. First, the local newspaper ran a feature story about Safe Haven's success rate. 83% of residents found stable housing and employment within 6 months. Then the state's housing authority reached out asking if they could use our model for a pilot program in 3 other cities. In September, the mayor presented me with the Community Hero Award at a ceremony I'd tried to decline, but Edward insisted I attend. "You've transformed this town's understanding of what justice means," the mayor said, handing me a plaque I didn't want, but accepted graciously. "You've shown us that healing is stronger than hatred, and that redemption is possible even after terrible wrongs." The best news came in August, a letter from the state parole board informing us that Ruth had been granted early release for good behavior. She'd served 5 years instead of 7, and would begin her 5-year house arrest in January 2025. Edward had already prepared a room for her at Safe Haven, right next to his own. 45 years, he'd said when the letter arrived. "We've waited 45 years to be together. What's a few more months?" Now standing outside Ethan's school on a crisp October afternoon, I looked at the family I'd built from the ashes of the one I'd lost. Edward with his arm around my shoulders, Susan organizing volunteers on her phone, Ethan laughing with his club members, this generation learning to break cycles instead of perpetuating them. We'd helped 127 women find their second chances. My mother would be the 128th. I looked up at the sky, feeling the temperature drop, seeing dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The forecast had called for rain tonight, the first real storm of autumn. Everything had changed. But one thing remained: it was about to rain again. The rain came on a March morning 7.5 years after that terrible October night, when everything fell apart. I woke to the sound of it drumming on the roof, that same steady rhythm that had once meant fear and loss, and sleeping in a cold car with my frightened son. But this morning, I woke in a warm bed in a house that was finally truly mine, and the rain sounded different. It sounded like music. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the gray sky, watching water stream down the glass and pool in the garden Edward had planted. The roses were just beginning to bud, their leaves glistening with rain. In the driveway, I could see 3 cars, mine, Edward's truck, and the sedan belonging to one of our current residents, a woman named Jennifer, who'd fled an abusive marriage with her 2 children and was now 3 weeks away from starting a job as a paralegal. "Mom, it's raining again." Ethan's voice came from behind me, and I turned to see my 15-year-old son standing in the doorway, his hair still messy from sleep, wearing the Lincoln High School sweatshirt he practically lived in. I smiled at him, remembering another rainy day when he'd been 10 years old and terrified when we'd had nowhere to go and no one to help us. "Yes. Do you want to stand outside like we used to?" He came to stand beside me at the window, tall enough now that I had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "No. This time, let's watch from inside. Together." So we stood there together, mother and son, watching the rain fall on a home that had been lost and found and transformed into something better than it had ever been before. Behind us, I heard Edward's footsteps as he came into the kitchen and started making his famous Saturday morning pancakes. The smell of butter and vanilla filled the house, mixing with the scent of coffee and the rain-fresh air coming through the slightly open window. The doorbell rang at 8:30. Susan arrived with her daughter Emma, both of them carrying grocery bags for the communal breakfast we shared every Saturday with whoever was living at Safe Haven. Emma and Ethan had become genuine friends over the years, bonding over their shared, complicated family history and their determination to build something better from it. They disappeared into the living room to work on a school project while Susan and I unpacked groceries and helped Edward cook. "Mom's letter came yesterday," Susan said quietly as she measured out flour for muffins. "Did you get one too?" "Yes." I pulled the envelope from my pocket, still unopened. I was waiting for today to read it. "Will you read it out loud? I think we all need to hear it." So after breakfast, with the rain still falling softly outside and the house full of people I loved, I opened my mother's letter and read her words to the gathered family. "My dearest Mary," I began, and my voice only shook a little. "In 1 month, I'll be released from house arrest and allowed to come home. Home. That word means something different now than it did 7 years ago. Then home was a place I controlled through fear and lies. Now home is the place you've built through forgiveness and truth." I paused, looking around the table at Edward, at Susan, at Ethan, at the residents who'd stopped to listen. "You gave me what I didn't deserve, forgiveness. You gave Edward what he deserved, the truth. You gave Susan what she needed, a second chance. You turned the house, once a symbol of betrayal, into a place of healing. You're my greatest pride. Not because you're like me, but because you surpassed me. You became the woman I never had the courage to be." Edward reached across the table and took my hand. Susan wiped tears from her eyes. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn the grace you've shown me. I can never undo Ellen's death. I can never give you back the years I stole. But I can help you continue the work you've started, helping other women find the courage I never had, the strength you showed me was possible. Thank you for not leaving me outside in the rain. I'll see you soon. With all my love, Mom." I folded the letter carefully and looked up to see the rain had stopped. Through the window, a rainbow was forming in the eastern sky, its colors bright against the gray clouds. I stood and walked to the front door, stepping out onto the porch where I'd stood 7 years ago, locked out and alone. Now I looked at the sign Edward had carved, still hanging proudly above the door. "Ruth's House, a safe haven for second chances, in memory of Ellen Carter, who believed everyone deserves a home." Behind me, I could hear the sounds of family. Children laughing as they played in the living room. Edward teaching Ethan something about fixing the loose cabinet hinge, their voices low and patient. Susan in the kitchen with Jennifer, showing her how to make the casserole she could prepare ahead for her first week at her new job. The washing machine humming, someone's phone ringing. The normal, beautiful chaos of a house full of life. I stood in the center of it all and smiled, thinking about everything that had brought us to this moment. They say home is where the heart is. But I learned that home is where forgiveness lives, where second chances grow, where broken people become whole again. That rainy night 7 years ago, I lost a house. But I found something more. I found myself. I found my father. I found the strength to forgive. And in forgiving others, I finally forgave myself. The rain came again, but this time no one was left outside. Mary's Safe Haven program helped 127 single mothers over 5 years, providing not just housing, but hope and a pathway to independence. Ruth was released from house arrest in April 2025 and lived at Safe Haven with Mary, Edward, and Ethan until her peaceful death in 2029 at age 73. She spent those 4 years volunteering with the program, mentoring women who'd made mistakes and needed to believe in second chances. Edward and Ruth married in a small ceremony in 2026, 48 years after they first fell in love. They had 4 years together before Ruth's death, 4 years of the happiness they should have had all along. Susan and Mary co-founded a nonprofit organization for domestic abuse survivors in 2027, expanding their mission beyond housing to include legal advocacy and trauma counseling. The organization now operates in 6 states. Ethan graduated from law school in 2030 and became a family rights attorney specializing in cases involving fraud, forgery, and family betrayal. He never charges clients who can't afford to pay. "My mom taught me that justice shouldn't have a price tag," he tells people. Justice is not always about winning. Sometimes it's about everyone getting a second chance to do better. I hope this story touched your heart the way it touched mine to share it with you. Mary's journey from that rainy October night to the peaceful morning 7 years later reminds us that the worst betrayals can lead to the most profound transformations. Her story teaches us that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing the harm done to us. It's about refusing to let that harm define the rest of our lives. Ellen Carter never got to see justice served, but her memory became the foundation of something beautiful. David lived long enough to make amends even if he couldn't undo the past. Ruth found redemption not through escape from consequences, but through facing them with courage. Susan learned that being the favorite child in a broken family isn't actually winning, and Edward finally got to be the father he never knew he was meant to be. What would you have done in Mary's place? When you finally had the power to destroy the people who hurt you, would you have chosen mercy? Could you have turned a house built on lies into a home built on grace? These aren't easy questions, and I don't think there are perfect answers. But I believe Mary chose right. She chose the harder path, the one that required more strength than revenge ever would. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're going through your own rainy season right now, remember, these storms don't last forever, and sometimes the breaking is what lets the light in. Thank you for letting me share Mary's story with you. What part of her journey spoke to you most? I'd love to hear your thoughts.